The most sobering moment of my life happened as I hid underneath a moldy and waterlogged desk. Underneath that desk, I realized that, in all probability, this was it. I would never be able to go home again. I realized this as I hid from the snarling and heavy-breathing thing that I could hear just beyond the thin metal backing of the desk. The thing that I was sure would be the death of me. Sam, Nathan, and Ellie climbed into the truck, a snow-white 2016 used Chevy Colorado. My pride and joy since I had driven it off the lot only 2 years ago. Having already driven 2 hours, they weren't looking forward to another hour and a half, staring out of the window into the dull countryside of rural Tennessee. Once the last seatbelt had clicked, I slid the gear shifter in reverse and backed out of the empty lot of a Barnes & Noble bookstore. Within minutes of reaching the highway, Nathan had put in his earbuds. He was content with staring out of the window and listening to the latest episode of whatever his latest podcast fixation was. A look in the back seat revealed Sam scrolling through Instagram, and Ellie fast asleep on his shoulder. A puddle of drool cast a shadow of inevitability on his shoulder. He didn't seem to pay any attention to it. The silence was fine with me. I liked it, and evidently so did they. I had only known Sam and Nathan for just north of 4 months and Ellie only 7 more than that. Yet still I had no hesitation bringing them along for something that I usually did on my own or with one other person at the most. They all came off as capable enough to run away if we heard sirens outside, and mentally strong enough to not give up any names if they weren't fast enough. I had heard of this place in passing from some guy online. The post read, "School abandoned in the late 70s, early 80s, filled with all kinds of cool stuff." The post contained a myriad of photos of the hallways, dark and dusty, filled with what seemed like moving boxes, stuffed to the brim with books whose pages were no doubt laced with asbestos by now. The rest of the photos were things that he had pulled from said boxes. A few interesting things, old magazines, books, and a cassette tape labeled "Sex You Up," and promising enough. There had been times that a place like this looked like this. Old, filled with all kinds of relics from decades and generations that are long in the dirt. A single post was all that it took. One look at the geotag in the photo and I knew where it was. I had taken to looking in the inspect menu as most people don't like to give out addresses to these places. They adopted this faux anonymity for fear of graffiti artists covering the once spotless walls with a myriad of genitalia, profanity, and bad attempts at tagging their street names. All they did was make it take 20 more seconds for those who knew what to look for. The trip was on the longer end of the spectrum. The GPS had our drive time at 3 hours from my front door. After a quick game of road trip ABCs, everybody was off into their own little world. As the exit signs became fewer and fewer, and the 6-lane highway slowly turned into a one-way dirt road, I felt a weird sense of calm. All at once, my anxieties about this trip had faded. I didn't care if we couldn't get in. I didn't care if we would be the only ones there or not. I pulled into a small 2-pump gas station only 30 minutes from the decrepit ruins that could barely be called a school anymore. Out of instinct, I pulled out my wallet from my back pocket and flipped my debit card into my left hand. I paused for a moment as I realized that I would need to go inside to pay. Staring at the pump and the decades-old buildup of dirt and muck between the price sticker and the scratch-covered plate glass. Walking inside to pay, I stopped by a handwritten sign taped on the front door, equally as dirty as the pump. The sign read, "Cash only, no card." I stepped inside and was immediately thrown into the past. The walls were plastered with beer and cigarette ads, ranging from the 60s to the late 90s. The large room reeked of stale cigarette smoke and antifreeze, leaking from the no doubt ancient AC unit. Stepping up to the counter, I felt out of place, in opposition to these sweat-stained t-shirts, ragged jeans, and yellow trucker caps. I wore stainless Levi khaki pants, canvas Nikes, and a thin green flannel. The clerk looked me up and down for a moment. "What do you need?" the aged man behind the counter had asked. When he spoke, I was able to count the 5 yellowing teeth that he still had left. I pulled out my wallet, 2 crumpled singles of 20 and a receipt for dinner the night before. "Do you take debit?" "No card," he said, pointing to the sign on the door. "What are y'all here for?" He motioned between me and the others through the window next to him. "Ain't much to do here but work." He glanced back outside. "And y'all don't strike me as the type." "We're photographers. There's an abandoned school nearby that we heard about. Seemed like it was worth the drive." "Son, I'm gonna give you some of the best advice that you've ever heard." His voice somehow began to even get heavier as he spoke. "Some doors are locked shut for a reason, and sometimes that's for the best." He stared at me with such intensity that it felt like he was staring at a hole right through me. When I looked like tears were about to well up, I began to look for any way out that I could. "Yeah, 20 on pump 2. I slid the bill across the counter. He took it without breaking eye contact. "You stay away from there, you hear me?" I didn't answer. "You best pile your friends back into that spacecraft of a pickup you're driving. Turn your happy butts around." "Yes, sir," I said, turning my heel and making my way out of the door. Ellie was perched against the truck bed, eyes trained on Sam next to her. After about 2 minutes, the pump shut off and I closed the tank and reholstered the nozzle into the pump. And in a moment, we were off again. Nathan had one earphone out. Nathan's phone was sitting in the empty cup holder between us. The screen was still on. Enigmatic, the tragic mystery of Flight 1015. A story about people going missing. That didn't seem like the best thing to be listening to right now, but who was I to judge? As the road kept going in a straight line, I began to zone out, picturing all the things that we could find inside, the photos that we could take. In what felt like 5 seconds, the GPS dinged at me. "You've arrived at your destination." When I became fully aware again, I found myself parked in front of the school. The faded sign read, "Alderson Academy. The Word of God guides us." The lot was barren pulling in. My tires warbled and crunched over the tall crabgrass and weeds growing between the cracks in the concrete lot that looked like it hadn't been attended to since before I was born. 3 cars sat dormant at one end of the lot. Lined neatly in a row, all of their windows had been either rolled down or smashed. Their insides had been ransacked as if somebody had wanted to get rid of any resemblance to the interior of a mid-90s Ford Taurus. The dashes were smashed, glove compartments were gone entirely, and the steering wheels looked like they had been on the losing end of a fight with a sledgehammer. Each interior emitted the slightest hint of bleach from no particular source, as if the entire inside had been drenched at one point or another. Putting on our respirators, I found myself itching for a reason not to go inside. A burning sensation began to form at the pit of my stomach. All of a sudden, I was the one with cold feet. I had practically begged the other 3 to come with me. I couldn't just turn around. I found myself making a mental list of all the things that could go wrong. When I ran out of any plausible ones after the first few seconds, I fastened my respirator and made my way to the front door. Sam, Nathan, and Ellie not far behind. "You do this kind of thing a lot," I heard Nathan ask from behind me. When I turned around to answer him, I saw that the question was directed towards Sam. I didn't hear his answer, something about his brother in Peru. My mind was more occupied with what the man at the gas station had said to me before I left. "Some doors are locked for a reason." Those words echoed back and forth as I wrapped my fingers around the master brand padlock that held the front door shut. Next to the door stood a stone cherub. Slightly green with moss, it held a small basket above its head. Around the back, we stumbled on a window that had been left open. Not smashed, open. Behind the window lay a thick sludge of darkness, so thick that my flashlight was unable to pierce beyond a few feet past the window frame. Without hesitation, Ellie jumped through and landed on what sounded like a thin layer of gravel on a linoleum floor. Her personally customized worn Air Force Ones shifted back and forth, slowly eroding the floor with each step. This was layered with the oohs and ahs from somebody who had never set foot into an abandoned building. Next was Sam and Nathan after him. As I watched them go inside, I felt the same burning sensation in my chest that I had only ever experienced at the gas station. It felt like somebody was staring right through me. I stuck my head inside of the window and my eyes quickly adjusted to the blinding darkness. Everyone seemed off in their little world, each of them distracted by a different element in the room. Pulling my head back out, I was instantly blinded by the searing light. As I rubbed my eyes, I scanned the tree line, looking for any reason to pile back in the car and leave. Nothing. I saw a little bit of movement not far into the thicket, but managed to convince myself that it was just a squirrel. When my feet landed on what I had correctly assumed was a dirt-covered linoleum floor, I found myself making direct eye contact with a dusty painting of a giraffe picking leaves delicately from a treetop. As I scanned the rest of the room, I noticed everyone filing out of the collapsing doorway and into the main hallway that, from what I could guess from the pictures, stretched the entire length of the building. As I shuffled behind them, all was still taken aback by the enormity of the place. As we began to walk deeper into the maze-like design, beams of light darted from corner to corner, illuminating every crack and crevice the building had to offer. It wasn't long before we began digging through boxes, our form of archaeology. "Sam, come look at this," Nathan said as he had emerged from a doorway. All at once, 3 flashlights blinded him. He was holding something but kept it behind the door out of view. When the light hit his eyes, he shot both hands in front of his face, one to take off his glasses and the other to shield his eyes. As he did, whatever he held slammed to the floor with a loud crash. Whatever glass that he was holding was now in 1,000 different pieces scattered around his feet. Dang it. He bent down and fished out a small photo from what had been a picture frame and shined a light on it. The picture was a spitting image of Sam, with everything from the dirt mustache that one could almost call a real piece of facial hair, to the shoulder-length jet black hair. Sam laughed and took the photo and held it up to his face. I lifted my camera and took a picture. Sam folded the photo and shoved it into his back pocket. "It's mine now," he laughed. I began to walk around more, snapping photos of almost everything in sight. In what felt like seconds, I realized that I had secluded myself away from everybody else. With each click of the shutter button, the flash shot up and illuminated whatever was in front of it before snapping right back down. I took one last photo before turning around to rejoin the group, when I saw a glint of white writing above the doorway that I could barely make out in the darkness. "The path to salvation begins with a single step." I figured it looked nice with the light leaking through an open door with light spilling through and onto the filthy linoleum floor. I raised my camera and I snapped a photo. When the flash briefly clicked on, it revealed a long red gash to the left side of a door that led into a bathroom that I'd only just noticed. I clicked the button on the bottom of my light and it sprung to life for all of 6 seconds before sputtering out. I tried everything to turn it back on aside from replacing the batteries with new ones that I didn't have. In all honesty, I shouldn't have left here no worse off than when I had entered, but I didn't. Instead, I resolved to use my camera as a makeshift flashlight, using every flash to map out where I was. The first flash went off and I was all of 3 inches from smacking my nose into a wall. The second flash went off and I was able to get my bearings, and I felt my way to the edge of the bathroom wall. When my fingers wrapped around the cold edge of the painted cement blocks, I took another photo and watched as the gash got wider, with small spatters branching out from the top and bottom, something akin to a monochrome Pollock painting. As my camera flash went off again, it illuminated something that I still have trouble describing. It was a body. While it resembled more of a puddle than a human, blood, chunks of flesh, a covered muscle were strewn about on the floor, creating a standing puddle of it all. Bugs pulsed in and around where I assumed the face was at one point or another. It didn't feel real. I lost my balance as I stared into the darkness. Having seen the flash, my mind was able to vaguely remember the outline of what was now lying 3 feet away in complete and total darkness. Unnatural darkness. My ears began to ring and my legs gave out. My eyes dilated into tunnel vision as I landed heavily on my wrist and smacked my head against the wall behind me. I must have been screaming because in no time, Sam, Ellie, and Nathan were all standing over me. When they first had arrived, I could only make out vague muffled sounds as they beamed their flashlights into my eyes. As they stood over me, my hearing dialed back into reality and I became more aware of the aching coming from the back of my head and the burning sensation on my throat. I had no doubt been screaming. "What's wrong?" Ellie shouted at me. Before I had a chance to answer for myself, Nathan did it for me, letting out a yelp that was cut short by a string of vomit. Sam stood numb, shining his flashlight on the remains. Ellie noticed it next, and she let out a shrill and ear-piercing scream. You don't react the same way you think you would in a situation like this. I always found myself watching horror movies telling the characters to stop standing there and to just run. But at that moment, I finally understood what true fear was. It was paralyzing. It held all of us in place like statues. As we all stood there, sobering up from what we had just witnessed, an even worse thought crossed my mind. What did this to him? And even worse, is it still here? All of these thoughts took hold of everything inside of me, and the only way that I could convey them to the group was 4 words. We need to leave. I stood to my feet, using Ellie's wrist and arm as support to gain my footing. Jesus Christ, Nathan said as he wiped his mouth. What happened to him? His question came off as an equally genuine and morbid curiosity. The way that his voice cracked, it sounded like it almost hurt him to squeak out the question. Sam was still frozen, his light still shining on the body. He watched the insects pulse and scatter around every square inch of exposed nerve. Judging by the oxidation of the blood, whoever this once was had been here for at least a few days, no more than 2 weeks at most. Crap. Ellie let out and we all glanced over to see her holding her phone above her head. The white background of the emergency dial screen illuminated the brickwork. No signal. No, you've got to be doing something wrong, Sam said, finally snapping out of whatever trance he had been in before, beginning to make his way toward her. You can dial 911 no matter what company's tower you're connecting off of. Well, then there's no tower, Sam. Her voice began to break too. None of us knew how to deal with this sort of thing. I mean, who do you call? Where do you tell them that you are when there's nothing else for miles? When Sam finally tried the phone for himself, he was met with the same busy and no service signal that Ellie had heard. In an instant, they had stopped arguing. From down the hall, the unmistakable sound of boots on the dirty linoleum floor inched toward us at a slow and steady pace. We didn't know what to do. We froze in place for what felt like centuries, as the footsteps inched closer with every step. Whoever had been walking must have heard us notice them because they let out a shrill and almost inhuman shriek that echoed through the hallways. It was met with what sounded like a half dozen more from outside of the building, Just down the hallway behind us was the cracked open door of what I can assume used to be a classroom of some kind. Nathan was the first to spot it, opting to leave us and slink his way over without so much as a tap on the shoulder. I grabbed Sam and Ellie and soon we were right behind him. The classroom was laid out as stereotypically as one could imagine a classroom from the mid-70s. One large wooden and water-damaged desk at the front of the room was assigned specifically for the teacher, followed by 4 columns of 7 all-in-one desks. Along the left side of the room were 3 double-door coat closets. Sam and Ellie took one of those while Nathan and I sought refuge behind the desk at the front of the room. As Ellie and Sam shut the door behind them, they crawled inside the closet, and they let the door drop, with a loud clatter against the body of the wardrobe. I could hear them mentally cussing at the same time that I was. The footsteps got closer. None of us could see, but judging from where they had stopped, I was guessing that the person was standing in the doorway. I held my breath, as did Nathan next to me. I held it so long that all I could hear was my heartbeat growing faster and faster until I was sure that it was about to explode. My hands were glued to the floor, every muscle in my body stiff. I did my best to minimize anything that could make any noise whatsoever. A lump formed in my throat as I continued to hold my breath past the point of safety. I wasn't able to exhale until I heard Ellie's loud piercing scream come from the closet. I peeked my head over the desk. The large, hulking figure that had made its way into the room. Its body was almost humanoid. A deer standing on its hind legs, its arms were impossibly long and sloped off of its emaciated body. The tips of what I can only describe as claw-bearing fingers were dripped with red. Following the trail up and across its face led me to the fresh body of Sam. His face had been smashed against the coat hook in the inside of the closet. The end stuck through his eye socket, while the rest of it clung to a small strand of an optical nerve that hung just below of his chin. Faster than my eyes or brains could comprehend, the thing at its fist closed around Ellie's throat before slowly squeezing closed. The blood had rushed to her face, turning it beet red. Her eyes went bloodshot while refusing to blink at the monstrosity before her, almost trying to deny what was happening, to rationalize. This only lasted roughly a second before the thing made a complete fist, with a loud crack around Ellie's neck. Her scream ceased and her head dropped like a floppy children's toy. The thing relished at the moment, letting out 3 short and shrill screams at the top of its lungs, dripping red and saliva down the tattered and bloody clothes that it wore. By their condition, I assumed that it had stolen them from another person who had probably come to explore. When it grabbed and ripped off Sam's hanging eye and raised it to its lips, I slowly and carefully lowered myself back down to the ground below the desk. Nathan had plugged his ears with his hands and sat in the fetal position. I didn't blame him. Given my history of dealing with traumatic events, I'm still surprised that I wasn't doing the same thing. The sounds it made were awful. A cacophony of slurping, snapping, and ripping sounds drifted from the wardrobe. I went back to being paralyzed by fear. As it continued eating, I realized that this would probably be it. My life would come to a close with no loud bang. I would die as unremarkably as I lived. At this moment, I realized just how much I had taken my life for granted. All I wanted to do was break down and cry at the feet of God, apologize for every transgression that I had ever made against anyone or anything, to beg for my life. I began to quietly cry. A tear rolled down my cheek, and I didn't want this to be the end. As the teardrop hit the floor, the feast had stopped. My heart sank. I heard heavy panting from just beyond the desk, followed by one long and wet shriek. I could hear the concoction of blood and saliva being ejected from the creature's throat as it tried to communicate with whatever or whoever it was outside. Nathan panicked. He tried to run and he almost made it past the abomination, but it shot its lanky arms out and grabbed Nathan by the ankle, dropping the big guy painfully to the floor. knocking the wind out of him almost immediately. He tried to scream, but the lack of air in his lungs wouldn't let him. I did something that I still have trouble trying to justify. I ran. The way that I saw it, Nathan was dead. He was a sacrifice. The moment the thing had wrapped its bloody claws around his ankle, he was already reduced to a headstone that marked a closed casket funeral. I pivoted around the desk, knocking over every desk as I passed it to give myself as much lead room as possible. I heard Nathan's last attempt at a hoarse scream get cut off with a loud crunch. It let out one more high-pitched yell before I heard it begin to chase me. No, run after me. I pivoted around the doorway and ran down the hallway, one foot in front of the other. I dipped and dodged every stack of boxes and bookcase in the hallway while, behind me, I heard it barrel into every single object and keep going unfazed. At one point, after I had made it to the west wing where we had entered, I turned around to see it galloping on all fours after me. It was closer than I had thought, only about 5 feet behind my back foot. I kept running. My legs burned as if my veins pumped battery acid. I turned one last corner and saw the entrance to the room that contained the open window. I powered through and slid on the floor, catching myself by gripping the door frame and sliding my feet in. As I took my first step inside, the thing was going too fast to stop on a dime. I didn't waste the opportunity. I barreled straight through the window without trying to open it. I covered my face in the glass, sliced through almost every piece of exposed skin. I crash-landed against the crabgrass lawn and flipped to my back. The deer peered out at me from the blinding darkness. The wax jacket that it was wearing flopped open to reveal exposed rib and muscle. It did not attempt to reach me, simply slinking away to finish its meal. I began to laugh hysterically. I had no rhyme or reason. It was just the only response that I could muster up to keep myself from either passing out or shutting down completely. I laid my head back in reverence only to see a small child standing over me. He wore a small mask made from the skull of what looked like to be a dog. He raised his finger to where I approximated his mouth to be in a shush gesture. I felt something sturdy crack against the side of my head, and I slipped into a peaceful sea of pitch black. When I came to, my head was throbbing and my hair felt wet and heavy. It was dark out by now. I have no idea how long I had been unconscious. All I knew was that it looked like the sun had set hours beforehand. In front of me were 8 figures around a bonfire. All were dressed in robes and wearing animal skull masks that obscured their faces. I tried to move but came to the realization that I couldn't move. 2 large ropes had been tied around my chest and my legs too, and kept my back flat against a tall oak tree. One of the figures approached me, a woman. Her blonde hair protruded the sides of her mask and draped down her shoulders. She pushed her face only 2 inches from the tip of my nose, and I let out the only response that I could think of. "What is this? Who are you people? I'll give you anything, just let me go." The woman removed her mask. Her face had been disfigured at one point or another. Large scars left tracks all over her face. Her lips had been cut open on multiple occasions. "Shh," she said, revealing a set of deep red teeth. She shushed me as if she were a mother trying to calm down an unruly child. "It's not about money, it's about you," she said as she pointed one finger at my chest, still talking in a calm voice. A sweet voice that almost made me forget where I was. She extended her left hand behind her with her palm open, still pointing one finger at me and never once breaking eye contact. One of the other figures, a man this time, handed her a very large and very old hunting knife. She traced it up and around my torso, eventually landing on my stomach. She balanced the knife tip just above my belt buckle. "This is going to sting, but it will all be over soon," she said, still talking in that nurturing voice before pushing the knife into my stomach. I was met with the worst pain that I had ever felt in my life. I screamed and she shushed me again. She began to drag and twist the knife. When I wouldn't stop screaming, she covered my mouth. After what felt like 5 lifetimes, she pulled out the knife. "It's all over, go to sleep," were the last words I heard before I lost consciousness again. When I came to, the sun had risen. The bonfire was nothing but smoldering embers and burnt logs. Around it lay the bodies of all 7 figures still wearing their robes. The woman lay at my feet, still. All at once, I was reminded of the surgery that I had been given the night before. My knees gave out and I slid down the tree into a squat that did nothing but add to the pain. I let out another scream. Over the next several minutes, I began to break away from the rope by sliding up and down the rough tree bark. After I was free, the next several days come in flashes. I remember running to my truck only to find it destroyed and bleached like the others. The next thing I remember is running into the road, covered in red and screaming like a madman. At some point, a truck must have stopped for me and let me in because the next thing I remember, I was trying to mumble the story out to the driver as he drove me to the nearest hospital. When he helped me limp through the sliding doors, I collapsed from blood loss. According to Dr. Foster, I died for 2 minutes as they tried to fill me with as much blood and essential fluids as I had lost. Over the coming days, I recovered in the hospital, keeping a close eye on who entered my room. Police came by as soon as I was lucid again. Wiltshire County Sheriff's Department, their badges red. They asked me as many questions as they could before disappearing again. After 5 days in the intensive care unit, I was finally transferred to a shared room and was finally able to sleep through an entire night. I don't like it here. Last night, a nurse came and woke me up in the middle of the night. "It's all over, just go to sleep," she said, smiling at me, revealing a set of deep, red teeth before everything went black. When the people next door moved out, I was over the moon. It meant no more having to listen to the dog they kept tied up in the backyard yapping morning, noon, and night. It was a horrible animal, looked closer to a rodent than a hound. It meant no more being woken up at 2 a.m. by the sound of tires screeching to a halt. I would lie in the dark staring up towards the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for what came next. The slurred and raised voices, the doors being slammed shut, and then the music beginning. It went on some nights until dawn, and I didn't get any sleep. The people next door moving out also meant no more things would be thrown into my backyard by them. No more crushed beer cans or empty popcorn boxes. I swear they thought my backyard was a refuse dump. I complained, of course. I phoned and wrote to the authorities. I was told at first to keep a diary of the disturbances, which I did, and when I sent copies of that, I was told that somebody would come visit. But they never did. I called the cops as well, but they didn't come either. Through all of this, I never confronted the people next door directly, though I wanted to so badly. I was convinced if I had, that they would become violent, and I was not somebody who could defend themselves in a fight. And so I suffered, for 5 years in all, until that day when I was taking out my trash, like a civilized person does, with it in a bag tied at the top, that I would put in my bin. I was stood on my front porch when I saw the trunk of their car open and there were suitcases and bags on the ground. And then the man appeared. He was staggering under the weight of a large cardboard box, which he loaded into the trunk before slamming the lid closed. Or he tried anyway, but the box was too big to fit in and the lid wouldn't shut. A reasonable person would have taken the box out and tried a different arrangement, but not him. He slammed the lid down again and again, cussing each time that he failed. And then he just seemed to give up and he left the trunk hanging open while he turned his attention to throwing the suitcases and bags into the back seat of the car. There was no sign of his partner, and the part of me which enjoyed late-night true crime shows on TV as a guilty pleasure began to wonder if he had done away with her. If one of their drunken arguments had gone too far and she was now buried out in the backyard. But no, she appeared. A handbag dangling off each arm and carrying the yapping monster. It had on a little red neckerchief. Ignoring the man who was now trying to force more bags into the back seat, even though they were clearly full, she got in the passenger seat and sat there while the dog squirmed and yapped. Finally, he managed to force the back doors of the car closed and climb behind the wheel. The engine started on the third attempt and they rattled away. My house and theirs were the only two around and were situated at the end of a mile-long narrow road. Everything else for a good distance was woodland. After they had pulled away and disappeared out of sight, I went to stand in the middle of the road and I listened. And do you know what I heard? Nothing, except the chatter of the birds in the trees and a few branches being rustled by the breeze. A couple of tears ran down my face. I wiped them away and went back inside my house. It was such a good feeling. A weight had been lifted. I hoped. Had they really been them moving out, or were they just going on vacation and in a week or two they would be back, and my waking nightmare would start over? I was mightily relieved then when a couple of days later, a truck pulled up in front of the house and a for sale sign was erected next to the porch. I said, "Yes," and I punched the air. That got me a funny look from the man who had put the sign up, but he said nothing and packed his tools up and drove away. I went over to have a closer look at the sign. I couldn't imagine what the point of it was. This was a dead-end road, so there were no passing traffic. No one walked along here either. Maybe it was something the realtors did automatically for all the properties that they handled, I figured, and then I punched the air again. The for sale sign didn't matter. What did matter was that I was finally free of my horrible neighbors and their dog, the yapping rodent beast. I went back into my house. I never drank alcohol, but if there had been a beer in the fridge, I would have cracked it open. As it was, I made myself a cup of peppermint tea and took a chair out into the backyard, where I drank my tea and listened to the sounds of the woods uninterrupted by anything or anyone. It was early evening by the time that I went back inside. I liked everything to be just so in my house. The pans in the kitchen were hung in order of size. The knives, forks, and spoons were all in their separate drawers, and I rinsed out the bin in the kitchen at least once a day with hot water. It was the same in all of the other rooms in the house, and there was one cozy clean room in particular that I wanted to be in that moment in time. I went upstairs to my bedroom. I was shattered and fell asleep the moment that my head hit the pillows. I slept straight through and woke feeling refreshed. The sunlight streaming in through the window had never looked so good. I had inherited the house from my parents when they had passed, and I thought about them as I started giving it a spring clean. I spent all day happily dusting and vacuuming and polishing, and that night, I slept well again. The only thing that started to intrude on my positive mood over the days that followed was worrying about who might buy the house next door and move in. What if they were even worse than their predecessors? It was possible, but I told myself that it was going to be okay. As soon as somebody new moved in, I would go over and introduce myself with a smile and a handshake. It would be a good start, a neighborly start. It turned out, though, that I was worrying about the wrong thing. About 2 months after the people next door moved out, a truck pulled up outside and the man that I recognized from last time took the for sale sign down. What did that mean, I wondered? If the house had been bought, Surely a sold notice would have been pasted over the sign in place. Realtors are never shy to sing their own praises, even if I was the only person who could see that they had closed another deal. Also, no one had been to view the property as far as I knew. After a period of feeling pretty settled, my nerves started to jangle. I had to know what was going on. I found the number of the realtors online and I called them up. Hi, I said. I'm interested in the property on Creech Lane. I would like to arrange a viewing. This was a lie, of course, a way to get them to open up to me. And it worked. The man who had answered paused for a second before replying. Yes, that property was on our books, he said, and then there was another pause. My heart started to beat a little bit quicker. Come on, don't leave me hanging, I thought. The owner of the property put it up for sale after his tenants moved out without giving notice, he finally continued. But sadly, he passed away and the house now cannot be sold until probate is complete. I believe there may be complications around this. Family disputes, though, I really can't say anymore. However, it does mean that the lawyer acting for the estate has asked us to take the property off the market, which is a shame, but we have a number of similar properties available. If I can just begin by taking your name. I ended the call before I could get dragged into a sales pitch, and then went to get a glass of water from the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I drank it. What I had learned had come as a shock. My nightmare neighbors had not owned the house next door, it seemed, and the person who had was dead, leaving the illegal vultures to move in, which left me wondering, how long would the house next door remain unsold and empty? The thought of living next door to a property that was as good as abandoned had bothered me. I put a jacket on and stepped out into my front porch, locked my door. I always did, you can never be too careful. And I walked towards the house next door. I had never been inside and had kept my distance while the house was occupied. As much of a distance as I could while living side by side with those horrible people. The front yard was overgrown with weeds and I noticed a crushed beer can sat by their porch. I decided to leave it where it was. I would come back later with gloves on and a garbage bag to put it in. There were cigarette butts lying among the weeds as well, as if somebody was trying to seed the ground with them and grow a bumper new crop of cancer sticks. The pane on the front door was peeling off and there was a hairline crack in the window nearest to the door. None of this came as a surprise to me. I had made a point of not even wanting to look at the house. It unsettled me, it was so dirty and disheveled. But seeing it up close like this and making myself see the truth warts and all left me feeling depressed. I moved slowly around the side and peered into one of the windows there. The glass was filthy, but I could see pizza boxes standing open on the floorboards, and burger cartons on a small table in front of a TV and more scattered across the floor. Shriveled fries lay spilled out of one. There was what must have been a burger bun as well, only now it was covered in green spores. And as I stared, I began to make out tiny specks circling the floor. They were flies, I realized, a lot of them too. I had the awful feeling that there must be a lot more refuse in the house, food and who knew what else, and that the people next door had not bothered to throw out before they left. They just left it to rot and it had attracted the flies, and worse. As I watched, a maggot wriggled out of one of the burger cartons. I walked away, went back into my house and sat there feeling sick. I just wanted to live in a nice place and have a quiet life, but the house next door was ruining everything. After a while, I dragged myself upstairs. I was too unhappy to do anything, so I went to bed. I couldn't get to sleep though, and around 4 a.m., according to the clock by my bedside, I heard a noise outside. There was someone moving around. Now, like I've said, the road doesn't lead anywhere and no one had any reason to be near my house or the one next door, unless they were lost or up to no good. I got out of bed and crept over to the window to try and see who was out there, and I saw a dark shape trot past. It wasn't a person, it was an animal, some kind of dog, I guessed as my eyes had adjusted to the dark. It was big and feral looking. I had never seen the like before around here and was wondering what had attracted it, when I saw it pad over to the house next door and began sniffing around the door. Was it the scent of the mess that people had left behind that had drawn it in? It continued sniffing as it moved around the house until it was out of sight. I went back to my bed and sat down. Not only was the house next door an eyesore, and a bug-infested one at that, it was now attracting scavengers. I could have wept. Through the rest of that night and the days and sleepless nights that followed, I did a lot of thinking. I felt like a victim and I hated that, but what could I do? One idea that I had was to sell my house and buy another place with the proceeds. It would break my heart to walk away from the house that had meant so much to my parents, in which they had gifted to me, but if I stayed here, I was worried that I would become ill with all the stress and worry. Trouble was, I knew having an empty house next door that was already in such a bad state would massively devalue my property. Financially, it would be a disaster. I kept trying to think of other options, but I just couldn't. The weeks and months continued to drift by. I started keeping my windows closed all the time because there was an increasingly bad smell coming from the house next door. It made my eyes sting and left me feeling nauseous. I heard and saw more animals, all mangy, vicious-looking things near the house next door. I was close to tears most of the time. I hardly slept and I had no appetite. It was all too much. And then from somewhere I found a bit of inspiration. The authorities had not lifted a finger to help me when my life was being ruined by the people next door. And I was not naive enough to think that I was going to change, unless I kicked up enough of a fuss. The house next door was a public health hazard. Surely it must have been. And there must have been laws against that, right? I would contact the authorities and the press, and go on social media and demand that something be done. I would name the realtors and urge the late owner's family and lawyer to do something. This wasn't like me. I had spent my entire life being a pushover. Well, enough was enough. It was time to speak out. First, I knew I needed proof. I made sure my mobile phone was fully charged and then I went outside. I began by filming the exterior of the house next door. Water dripped from gutters that were clogged with leaves. The windows were covered in a film of grime, and there was more trash that had just been left in the backyard. It disgusted me, but I knew that it wouldn't be enough. I needed to go inside. It probably won't come as a great surprise to learn that I had no idea how to break into a property. I peered at the lock on the front door and then moved to a window and wondered about smashing it, but decided that I would probably end up cutting myself and I would need to go to the ER. I ended up standing back at the front door, and I kicked it in sheer frustration. There was a cracking sound. I kicked it again harder, and the door broke. I pushed it tentatively with my hand and the door swung open. I was in. The smell hit me first. The bittersweet stench of things gone off. I gagged and covered my mouth and my nose with my hands. My eyes began to water and I blinked rapidly to try and clear my vision. Thankfully, the camera on my phone was unaffected by the miasma lying heavy inside the house. I panned across the narrow hallway, capturing the evidence for my expose. Spider webs hung from the ceiling and the exposed light bulb in its center. They were dotted with flies that had been caught, but there were plenty more that were still free. Some were brushing against my face and hands. I tried to push them away with a sweep of my hand and I walked forwards. The room that I had looked into was to my left. I entered it, keeping one eye on the floor. I didn't want to step on any bugs. I knew they would come off worse, but the thought of having to wipe their squashed remains off the sole of my shoe creeped me out. There didn't seem to be anything wriggling around down there though. I peered nervously into one of the open pizza boxes. A green and black mold spread out across the base of the box. Having seen the mold in the box, I started seeing it everywhere. It crept up the arms of the sofa and filled up burger cartons, and even it reached the walls and the floor. I had been about to put my foot in a big old patch of fungal gunk, but had noticed it just in time. Lucky escape, I thought as I stepped over it, which is when the floor collapsed below my feet. I felt myself falling through rotten floorboards, felt the shock of impact, and the breath being knocked out of my body when I landed moments later. I was in the basement. It was dark and dusty and my head was spinning. I gasped, trying to push myself up, and then something touched one of my hands. I flinched, pulled it up and saw a maggot wriggling on my sleeve. I raised my other hand to squash it but realized that there were more on that hand, and that there were more on my legs and feet, all around me. The ground was covered in them, and they were wriggling under and over each other, and through a skull that was inches from my left hand. It was the skull of a canine, and the bugs were pouring out of its empty sockets and crawling down its fangs. Just beyond the skull were the remains of another animal. I could make out its spine and its pathetically slim tailbone. The bugs were making it twitch, animating it as if it moved. I realized with disgust that these must have been the skeletal remains of the wild animals that I had seen around the house. Somehow they had gotten down here, and they had not escaped. There were dozens of skeletons. I could see that now in the gloom. Some still had flesh on the bone. One was close to whole. Its flesh was dark and rotting and fetid in that confined and airless space. I stared at it, too horrified to move as the bugs slowly began to cover me. I had to get out of there. I had to get out. I told myself this, begged my limbs to move, but I was paralyzed by fear. One of the bugs reached my lips. I couldn't breathe. If I did, I would breathe it in. I felt them on my neck and in my hair. Have to get out, have to get out. My mind raced and somehow I managed to move one of my hands. I lifted it. Bugs covered it like a second writhing skin. I arched my back. I shuffled backward a little, and then I started to get to my feet. Every movement was a battle. Every moment I thought that I was going to fall back down and into a shroud of them. My hands found a wall and I followed it until I found the basement door and I scrambled up the steps. I realized that I had dropped my phone, but there was no way that I was going back for it. I staggered forwards, heading for the hallway, for the front door. And then I was stumbling, falling, and crawling on my hands and knees out onto the front porch. I was still covered in the bugs. I could feel one in my mouth. I spat and a fat, white monstrosity landed in the weeds and wriggled around in a pool of my own phlegm. I clawed at my skin and my hair to try and get more off, all the while heading for my house. I was at my front porch. There were a lot of bugs on the ground by now, but it felt like there were still hundreds of them inside of my clothing. Thankfully, there was no one else there to see as I stripped off my clothes and swept the rest of myself clean as best as I could. And then I ran into my house and straight through to the shower, where I stood under scalding hot water and tried to bear it as long as I could. I was feeling lightheaded by the time that I headed back into my front room. I had on a t-shirt, old blue jeans, and sneakers, and I felt my skin raw but clean at the same time. I sat in my favorite, comfy armchair and took a deep breath. I needed to think, to understand what had just happened, so I could work out what to do next. One explanation came to me quickly. It was that the house next door was somehow changed. It had become a trap, one that attracted victims to feed its new, warped nature. Each victim was drawn in by the scent of the rotting flesh of the animal that had gone before, and me, I had been drawn in on their trail. I knew, though, that this could not be the case, not in a world where science and reason ruled. The truth was, my nerves were shattered and it was my imagination running riot. But I could not shake the feeling that I had been in the grip of something twisted, something malevolent, and I had escaped from it by the skin of my teeth. I took more deep breaths and told myself that I was safe in here, in my ordered, clean house. I just needed to rest, to close my eyes and get a little bit of sleep. I sighed, started to drift off, and then I saw the bug on my pristine floor. It must have wriggled off my body while I was rushing for the shower. I shot to my feet. I needed to stamp on it, but it was gone. It had disappeared into a gap between the floorboards. And then I saw another, and another one. I couldn't stay in this house after this. I would find a motel for the night and then think on what to do next, though I honestly didn't know what that would be. I headed for the door and opened it. The house next door brooded, silent and foul. I stared at its windows, its broken door. Something told me that it wanted me to go back inside and lie down in the darkness. I shook my head. I felt like I was losing my mind. I retreated back into my house and I bolted the door. I'm sitting in my bedroom right now writing this. I'm going to press post soon because it's getting harder and harder to concentrate. I'm so tired and I feel sick, and I can't stop thinking about the house next door. How if I went back, I would finally be at peace. There would be no more noise, no more fear. I would know nothing as I decayed, and the house next door fed on my rotting remains. No, dang it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go downstairs and leave my house. I'm not going to let myself be drawn into the house next door. I'm going to walk the mile along the road to where there are lights in the distance and passing traffic. I'm going to hitch a ride and go a long way away and start over. This is the end of my story, and a beginning. There's nothing quite like the smell of fresh-baked bread coming out of the oven. What if I told you that you could get all of that deliciousness with none of the time and work involved? Well, you can from Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first ever bake-from-frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. Wild Grain uses a slow fermentation process that's easier on your belly, lower in sugar, and rich in nutrients and antioxidants, unlike typical supermarket bread. Every item bakes in 25 minutes or less as well, which is very convenient. Wild Grain is offering delicious products such as an ancient grain sourdough loaf and fresh artisan fettuccine pasta. I received both of these items in my Wild Grain box and both were absolutely delicious. They tasted better than the regular stuff that I would buy at the store, and much more fresh. My favorite had to be the ancient grain sourdough loaf. It was great for sandwiches or just good on its own with some butter and oil. And I felt good after eating it, not weighed down or too full. Plus, for every new member, Wild Grain donates 6 meals to the Greater Boston Food Bank, so you can eat good and do good all at the same time. All you have to do is sign up at wildgrain.com/creep and choose which type of box you want to receive and how often. It's easy to reschedule, skip, or cancel. Plus, for a limited time, you can get $30 off the first box, plus free croissants in every box, when you go to wildgrain.com/creep to start your subscription. Yeah, you heard me, free croissants in every box, and $30 off your first one when you go to wildgrain.com/creep. That's wildgrain.com/creep, or you can use promo code CREEP at checkout. I'm trapped in a perpetual horror, a Groundhog Day of seismic proportions. The world feels a little grislier with every reset. I've always known that some sort of higher power must be the architect of my eternal torture. What other explanation could there be? But I no longer simply know of that power. I've seen it. Let me rewind. I'm used to doing that after all. I don't know how many times I've relived the past 2 decades. Enough times to slowly go insane. I've done some crazy stuff in a manic attempt to break free. I actually thought that I could end the cycle by altering the course of the future. During the present iteration, I haven't really bothered. I'm tired. So you're experiencing the natural course of events, I suppose. In the past, however, I've shaken things up. Let's just say there was an iteration in which I invested wisely, became a billionaire, and used my riches to change the landscape of the world. I even paid extraordinary amounts of money to scientists who promised they could uncover the secrets of the universe. I thought that they could fix whatever had happened to me. The problem is that they never truly believed my story. They didn't really try to understand how a time loop would work, so their research was half-hearted. Nobody has ever been able to save me. And before anybody asks, death is not the answer. It just resets the loop. I find myself waking up in the morning of December 31st, 1999. I celebrate the commencement of a new millennium with my family, and we admire the fireworks. At this point, of course, I probably lived for a millennium. The horror of waking in my 13-year-old body with a 36-year-old mind never fades. Well, I suppose I'm probably 3,600 years old. Who knows? I'm certainly not counting. But I always detest reliving my teenage years. I pretend to be a normal child and blend in with my peers. I strive to not say things that would reveal my adult mind. One of the scariest aspects of my existence is the possibility of accidentally revealing secrets about the future. That has really created a problem before. In one horrifying iteration, the knowledge of my prophetic ability led the British government to conduct torturous experiments on me. But a few months after the very first reset, I actually decided to seize the opportunity to make better decisions. Maybe it's a second chance, I had decided. I took care of my health, I married the same girl, but I was a better husband and managed to prevent the divorce. I spent more time with our kids. I was a better version of myself. As December 31st of 2022 approached for the second time, I thought that I had done what the universe had wanted me to do. You can imagine my unbridled terror when the loop reset, and that's when the penny dropped. I'm stuck. Madness ensued. 4 resets later, I tried ending myself. That didn't work. I tried hundreds of times in hundreds of ways, no luck though. So I've given up and resigned myself to this nightmarish existence. Well, perhaps given up wouldn't be entirely accurate. During every fresh iteration, I do try something new to break the cycle. This time, I posted about my experience online. I might pretend to have lost hope, but actions speak louder than words. I mean, I have to be honest, I've never gone completely wild. I've never completely ruined my life. I've stripped and run through the local park, but I've never, say, robbed a bank. I can't sabotage my reputation. What if the loop has ended? Every time that I reach December of this year, I start to wonder that. It's what keeps me from entirely unhinging and doing something foolish. I don't want to endure this infinite torture. I guess that I still believe I can break free of the cycle. I believe in January 1st, 2023. I'm sure all of you will see it. Surely when that day arrives, I'll have discovered a way to move beyond the loop. Eventually, I have to make it to the next year, right? What's the alternative? I can't seem to die after all. Well, that's what I used to believe. After a certain number of resets, I began to notice something disquieting. It started during one particular December of 2022, and it always begins during this final pre-reset month. Something is watching me. I might stroll down the road and catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. On street corners, I've seen a man with eyes that have no pupils. And that's not all. I've heard things that other people say they can't hear. There are shushing noises with no source. I wake in the night, bathing in a pool of sweat, assured that I've spotted glassy pinpricks in the darkness. Sometimes they rapidly vanish, as if the thing has closed its eyelids to avoid detection. Other times, the eyes linger hovering in front of me. He seems to be getting bolder, closer. Last week, I visited an art gallery and I saw a terrifying painting. My wife and friends commented on its beauty. Boundless beauty, my wife had said. They frowned at my gaunt complexion, and one friend even called me a wimp. I suppose it would seem like an odd reaction. After all, the painting depicted an ordinary man. But my eyes strolled down the uncanny valley, gazing at his dreadful face. Something about him was marginally off, and for the briefest of moments, the gallery light caught his painted eyes in such a way that the pupils had disappeared. I found myself staring into the vacant eyes from various street corners in my darkened bedroom. They were boring into my skull. I whimpered in terror. I've been to that art exhibit in every iteration of this time loop. On December 10th, 2022, my wife and friends always dragged me to it, and I'm certain that painting wasn't there in any of the previous iterations. In that exact spot, there had been a painting of Big Ben proudly displaying 11 o'clock. That means things are changing, and I don't think they're changing for the better. I have considered letting go. My fight is fading. Perhaps I should embrace the entity with open arms. Perhaps it has come to release me from this nightmare. It could offer a finite death and put an end to the loop. But what if it delivers a worse fate? Every time I see the glassy-eyed man, I feel my chest coil into a clove hitch. He isn't good. He isn't trying to save me. I need to figure out how to reach January 1st, 2023. And December 24th, 2022. Merry Christmas. The man on my doorstep was a frosty fellow, so I thought of him as a somber snowman. He had not come to offer glad tidings or a tuneful carol. I knew that before he even opened his mouth. I quaked in horror, dreading what he might have to say. "Who are you?" I timidly queried. "Somebody who can help," he responded. "I saw your first post." My breath inflated. I rooted myself to the ground, too shaken by the menacing statement to muster any kind of reply. "Who is it, Jake?" my wife called. "The postman," I shouted. No matter how many lifetimes I live, I despise lying to Vanessa. But the truth is too complicated. There has only been one time that I ever explained my looping predicament to her. She didn't believe me. She thought that I was mentally unwell. Since that iteration, I've always kept it a secret from her. "How did you find my address?" I eventually whispered. "Does that really matter?" he replied. "I had to see you. I traveled a long way. I think I can stop what's happening to you." "Not here," I blurted. "My family's inside." "Time is not on your side," he firmly told me. "I'm trapped in an endless loop, so I would beg to differ," I facetiously quipped. "It's not endless," the stranger coldly replied. "You feel the thing with no eyes getting closer, don't you?" Before I could pry my trembling lips apart, Vanessa appeared behind me. "Hello," she exuberantly said. The man weakly smiled. Merry Christmas. I was just telling your husband that I must have foolishly left some of his parcels at the office in town. Right, I added. In fact, I think we should come down to the delivery office. What have I told you about ordering presents late, Jake? Vanessa mumbled, rolling her eyes. I know, I smiled. Don't worry, I'll be quick. Away from Vanessa's prying ears, we decided to meet at the town hall, which was only around the corner. Still, the drive to our rendezvous point was unsettling. I followed the man's black sedan in my beaten-up family car. No matter which radio station I chose, however, I was horrified to find that the same song played. Stairway to Heaven. The once beautiful guitar passage now seemed to harbor a sinister secret. I turned off the radio, but silence didn't make the journey any easier. The disused roads of the festive season felt haunted. Trundling behind the mystery man's sedan, I stole glances at icy alleyways on either side of the road. Shivering, I kept expecting to see him. I was too petrified to breathe, fearing that the glassy-eyed man might find me if I were to gasp for even the smallest pocket of air. We parked on a quiet, residential street and went for a stroll. The sun was descending on the nearby town hall and the streets were starting to empty, but I was a little relieved to see at least some signs of life. Regardless, I knew that wouldn't keep the dark creature from me. What makes time so special? The man suddenly asked. I shrugged. We all have it, the stranger answered. Please, just tell me what. I was interrupted by the jarring sound of nearby lampposts shattering. The night embraced us like a thin blanket. Shushing filled the air like a ghoulishly glacial wisp of wind. I have never been consumed by such existential terror, and this is coming from a man who has been alive for countless millennia. I've even welcomed death with open arms, but that moment above all others truly haunted me. There are things worse than death, after all. Glassy spheres emerged from the blackness, hovering at the other end of the pavement, as hauntingly garish eyeballs illuminated the void which engulfed it. A black shape moved towards us. Find me after you reset, the internet stranger whispered. Time is dwindling, but the man did not have the opportunity to finish his sentence. His face lost its color. Those glassy pinpricks were suddenly occupying the stranger's eye sockets. My mystery visitor howled in agony, and his flesh had started to incinerate. There was no fire, but you wouldn't know that from the sight and smell of the man's disintegrating flesh. Blackened strips of skin peeled from his skeleton. His wall was that of a dying animal, desperately crying for a savior that it prayed would emerge from the darkness. Nothing came to save the man. Collapsing to his knees, his clothes shriveling atop his melting flesh, the stranger's cries mutated into hoarse whispers. I saw his tongue wither in his open mouth. I think he tried to say something with his final breath, but all that he could achieve was the most horrific moan. He was reduced to the blood-red meat beneath his skin. I suppose there were still gauntly eyes lodged in his skull. They weren't his eyes, though. Bereft of life, the man toppled to the ground. From his burnt body, a specter ascended. Those soulless pinpricks materialized in the shadowy darkness, gazing into my soul. The glassy-eyed man did not speak. I, on the other hand, could not speak. Suddenly, there was pain. Inconceivable pain. I tentatively peered down to see a black limb, flesh composed of night itself, piercing my left shoulder. Terrified beyond comprehension, I tried to bellow in pain, but my fragile body could scarcely manage a whimper. When I woke, I was in my 13-year-old body. Of course, death would have been too easy. The man was right. Time, we all have it. Some of us have all of it. And before I could fully process my surroundings, I realized that my body was in agony. Blood was soaking into the bedding from the wound on my left shoulder. My wound was still there. Immortality was no longer a foregone conclusion. The glassy-eyed man could end me. Following a hospital visit with my bewildered and traumatized parents, I resolved to change. I would no longer accept this existence. I might not survive my next encounter with the glassy-eyed man, and who knows where he might send me if he were to kill me. After all, there might be an eternal torture worse than my current one. I couldn't rid my mind of that petrifying thought. I spent years searching for the stranger who had knocked on my door. Unable to wait for the formation of this subreddit in 2010, I decided to simply create it. I posted my experience on there. Nobody came to my house. In desperation, I posted on so many different websites, but I quickly realized my mistake. Surely I needed to repeat events in exactly the same way. I needed to submit the post on December 23rd, 2022. And I did just that. But there was no house visit. Perhaps I had already made too many changes to the timeline. Fortunately enough, I also avoided the glassy-eyed man. But I found myself resetting to iteration 3 on New Year's Eve 2022. I spent another 23 years waiting impatiently. And then 2 days ago, I submitted the first part of the post. I worried that I might have worded it too differently to catch the eye of the internet stranger, but it worked. Today, he visited me. I ushered him into the living room and prayed that my wife wouldn't overhear us. I hurried the stranger through his persistent riddling. I wasn't going to let the glassy-eyed man consume him. What's the significance of New Year's Eve in 1999? I asked. Do I need to go back and fix things? The stranger shook his head and he offered surprisingly a succinct explanation. A time loop is a glitch in the universe, the man said. The entity is here to end the glitch that caused the loop, and he believes that glitch is you. Something else is trapping you. Think, Jake, what happened back in 1999? And that's when I remembered. My body tensed and my heart filled with dread. Some boys were bullying a kid from our neighborhood, Pippa, a 10-year-old girl who never did anything to hurt anybody. The boys had locked her in the old Hawthorne house, a derelict, horrible place. I stood there telling myself that I wasn't complicit in the crime. I only watched. Inaction is action, I suppose. While the fireworks had distracted everybody at midnight, I slipped back into the house to rescue her, but she wasn't there. I assumed that she had escaped and gone home. Over the following week, however, missing posters had popped up. Pippa was never found. Even more horrifyingly, neither were the other 3 boys who had locked her in there. All 4 children had vanished before the start of the new millennium. I told the stranger the story and he nodded. There are things in this world that defy reason. I've seen them, and that's why I came to you. Pippa needs help, he said. I think she and those boys who stole in that house. I don't think the Hawthorne place abides by the rules of time. The man whispered. What do you mean? I asked, shuddering. The stranger paused. Based on things that I've experienced, I would say it's an 11 shrine. An unholy place that ensnares people at the turn of every new year. Such places exist outside of space and time. Pippa is the force that keeps resetting your timeline. If you free her and the boys, you might be saved. They would be returned to the moment of their disappearance in 1999, but that would be the original timeline, a parallel universe. When I returned to the house, I couldn't find the girl, I said. Why would it be any different if I were to revisit it? I told you, the stranger said. An 11 shrine exists beyond the construct of space and time, but it creates a bridge to our world between 11 p.m. and midnight on New Year's Eve. How did you learn these things? I asked, suspiciously, though I was admittedly a little late. I don't think you're ready for that tale, he said. And even if I were to tell you what happened to me, could I not still lie? You just have to trust me, Jake. All right, I conceded. How do I need to prepare for New Year's Eve? When the man explained that I would have to venture into the Hawthorne house at 11 p.m., I trembled in horror. I've spent Christmas Eve watching my family with teary eyes. Can I avoid the flesh-searing limbs of the glassy-eyed man for 6 days? I keep seeing those lifeless eyeballs in the darkest crevices of my house. Even now as I write, I could swear that I just heard a shushing from our wardrobe. Have you ever squandered an opportunity to prevent something terrible from happening to somebody? Maybe you've been caught in a time loop too. I suppose that you might not yet realize. You could reset tomorrow. It could happen on New Year's Eve 2034. Who knows? Over the festive period, I couldn't stop thinking about New Year's Eve 1999. I remember being terrified of those bullies just like the little girl. If I had been courageous enough to intervene, I wouldn't have faced the karmic retribution of a time loop. I am still in iteration 3, and since my previous post, I was sure to make note of the internet stranger's contact details, lest the glassy-eyed man should, once again, reduce my new friend to a smoldering carcass. What's your name? I asked. Harold Langley, the man answered. Harold still wouldn't tell me about how he knew such corrupted things as 11 shrines and spiritual forces. He told me that I already had everything that I needed to know. I knew to go back to the Hawthorne house between 11 p.m. and midnight on New Year's Eve. Any New Year's Eve would do, in fact. Well, I could simply wait to be reset to 1999. Then I could stop the boys from ever locking Pippa in the house, I suggested. Harold shook his head. Even if you were to return to the past and drag the children miles away from the Hawthorne house, the shrine would still entrap them at 11 p.m. on that fateful New Year's Eve. Remember, they're already there. The house exists outside of time. Much like your own loop, no matter where they might travel, their bodies will still reset to that house at 11 p.m. They can only be freed from within the 11 shrine. Sending me back to 1999 is a convoluted way of sending a message, I grumbled. She doesn't know what she's doing, Jake, Harold gently assured me. Pippa is calling for help from an ungodly realm, and that has incurred an abnormality in time. After a long discussion, I could no longer escape the fact that Harold knew far more about this topic than me. I had spent millennia searching for an answer, and I finally had one. I just couldn't accept that. In truth, I simply didn't want to go anywhere near the Hawthorne house. It imbued me with unspeakable thoughts. Every time I walked past it, I felt evilness surge through me. And I know that every child in my neighborhood felt the same way. The Hawthorns had died decades before our time, but we knew that something was deeply wrong with the building that they had left behind. The house felt like a living, unfeeling thing. It was crooked, out of place, ill-intentioned. New Year's Eve 2022. The Hawthorne house was exactly as I had remembered it, though the neighborhood was certainly much livelier. There were no missing posters, and the roads were littered with revelers, preparing for the new year that I had spent ceaseless centuries attempting to reach. 10:41 p.m. 19 minutes until I could reset, unless the glassy-eyed man finds and ends me. If Harold were correct, my only salvation would be to enter the Hawthorne house. At 11 o'clock in the evening, the shrine would open. There's something much more frightening about seeing a haunted house in the real world. I have never minded eerie buildings in photographs or films, but the Hawthorne house is the most terrifying place that I have ever visited. I gently walked from the moss-covered gate to the fatigued front door, which was painted a long faded blue. In the front yard, there was an unlabeled stone cross, submerged in overgrown, withered grass blades. There were 3 stories to the neglected building. Dark chasms lay behind the glassy panes, and the attic had a misted oval window. I felt a piercing pang of horror in my chest at the sight of a black shape moving behind the glass. Other than a private property sign on the front gate, there was nothing to ward away intruders. There was no barricade across the rotting front door, and it was unlocked, so it creakily inched open with a light push. Perhaps the mere sight of the horrid place was enough to deter most people from trespassing. I wish that I could have the same luxury. As I entered the Hawthorne house, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and lit the dismal place with my torch, revealing a hallway that led onto a ginormous staircase. There was an open doorway on the left-hand side of the hallway, and it led onto the lounge. I strolled into the dusty, asbestos-riddled death trap. In the living area, there was a sofa which had been partially devoured by vermin, but I collapsed onto it and waited. 11 p.m. My heart stopped. I wasn't fading away, and I was still in the present. No, this isn't the present, I reminded myself. The Hawthorne house exists outside of time. Nevertheless, my phone's lock screen displayed 2300, which was good enough for me. I wasn't resetting. That was the important thing. Before I could wrap my head around that, however, I noticed something. The walls were groaning. Chest undulating in terror, I leapt to my feet. The winding foundations of the house seemed to lament my presence. I took a look at the world outside of the mucky lounge windows. My dimly lit neighborhood was rapidly vanishing from view. Within seconds, everything beyond the exterior of the house was black. The bridge to the physical realm was gone. Though time was a foreign concept in that shrine to evil, I still felt that it shouldn't be wasted. I had no idea what happened to the children, and I had no idea what was about to happen to me. I needed to find them, and then I could focus on finding a way to reopen the bridge and escape. I don't know how to exit an 11 shrine, Harold had quietly admitted to me. Time works differently in there. I think it only opens a bridge to our world when it wants to do so. So I suppose you have to give it something that it wants more than Pippa and those boys. Those words rang in my head. I found myself meandering in the living room of that lost house. There was a large frame above the fireplace. Using my phone light, I studied the unnerving canvas that loomed above me. It was a painting of the Hawthorne house in its bygone glory days. I didn't recognize the 3 people standing in front of the house, but I assumed it had to be the Hawthorne family. The mother and father were prim and proper. They must have lived in the 1940s, judging by their fashion, but I wasn't really looking at them. I was looking at their boy. He was a skeletal thing. His flesh seemed to cling tightly to the outline of his skull. The indignant expression on his face was communicated through joyless eyes and thin lips. He had a complexion that was almost wholly white, and that strangely gave the jubilant expressions of his parents' faces a sinister undertone. Why were they so happy? Their son appeared half dead. Needless to say, the painting absolutely horrified me, but everything in that house horrified me. The swirling, nightmarish colors of the artwork felt like a fever dream. In the pristine oval windows at the top of the painted house, there was movement. The paint was actually moving. Unlike the movement that I had seen in the real-life oval window, these painted shapes were crystal clear. Pippa and the 3 bullies. Their mouths were agape, much like the man in the scream, and they were huddling together, ferociously banging their tiny fists on the window. As if that weren't horrifying enough, there was more movement in the picture. The painted mother turned around and started strolling along the path, heading towards the house. The sun was decaying before my very eyes. His painted form seemed to be crumbling, yet the father smiled and the mother continued walking towards the house. She reached the front door. Thumping followed. And I do not simply mean that I saw the painted mother thump the painted door. There was a thumping sound on the real-life door, which was in the hallway behind me. A blood-curdling screech followed. It was a woman, I suppose, but her voice was no longer sounding human. There was a guttural and distorted quality to it. "Don't take my child from me." I had no desire to hang around and find out what she meant. I sprinted from the living room to the hallway, praying that the front door would hold, and I held my body up the rotting stairs, 2 at a time. Plunging into the darkness, I prepared for the door to fly from its hinges. The thing for which I did not prepare for was suddenly finding myself standing on a well-lit, refurbished landing. The Hawthorne house had suddenly transformed into a lavish home. From the top of the staircase, I turned to face the downstairs hallway. The banging on the front door had ceased, and it opened to reveal the mother. She was an ordinary person, not a frightening apparition. I realized that I had wandered through a portal in time. I would say that my initial guess had been accurate. It seemed to be a snapshot of the 1940s. "Jonathan, tell Bert that dinner will be ready in half an hour," the mother shouted. "He's not in here, Sarah," Jonathan replied. The father's ghost startled me, though the couple seemed much jollier in this memory. He strolled straight through my body and walked down the stairs. Well, I told the boy that he could only play until I finished taking down the laundry. Sarah huffed. He was with the Dalton boys across the road, Jonathan said, now striding across the downstairs hallway. "I shall fetch him." The ghosts of the parents evaporated and the house transported to a different moment in time. There was crying from a room farther down the landing. As I walked towards it, I noticed more frames on the walls. They were less macabre than the portrait that I had seen in the living room. There were 3 paintings of the individual Hawthorne family members. Seeing an ajar door on the left side of the landing, I peered through the slight opening. The sobbing mother was sitting at her dressing table, which faced away from the doorway. I could only see the back of her body. The father was holding her shoulders and futilely striving to console her. "I cannot live without him, Jonathan," she wailed. "A mother cannot live without her baby." "You shouldn't have to do that," Jonathan promised. "I have found a way to return his soul to us. Francis acquired some books. There are rituals that can help, but they come with a price." "Any price," Sarah coldly interrupted. "And what of the boys who murdered our child?" Jonathan asked. "Death would be too merciful," she said. "I agree. From my readings, I have learned ways in which we could make them suffer. If we could transform this house into unhallowed ground, we could ensnare their souls and eternally trap them here. They would become part of the building's woodwork. We would have to build an 11 shrine on the eve of the new year. There might be consequences for others who step foot in this land, but do it," Sarah icily whispered. The world washed away again. I saw brief flashes of the parents in their bedroom. They were drawing bloody patterns on the walls. I heard sourceless screams, cries of anguish from the children who had murdered Bert, I assume. The jigsaw pieces were sliding together. The souls of Bert's killers were embedded in the Hawthorne house. Sarah and Jonathan had succeeded, but had they also managed to resurrect their child? I shuddered, remembering the ghastly painting of a withering Bert in the living room. Something told me that a happily ever after hadn't been in the cards for the fractured family. The lights extinguished. The fresh decor aged in seconds, returning the Hawthorne house to the present. Well, I suppose I wasn't really experiencing any sort of time period. Everything faded away except for one thing, one person. The mother. She was still sitting at her dressing table facing away from the doorway. Her vanity mirror was cracked and coated in filth. I couldn't see her reflection. Her clothes were dusty and tattered. Her once beautiful blonde hair was withered, and she was stroking it with a hairbrush. Her strokes were so vicious that clumps of hair were ripping from her head. No way, I'm not going in there. I attempted to cautiously back away from the door, but floorboards betrayed me. They moaned beneath my weight. The hairbrushing abruptly stopped. The old rickety vanity stool squeaked as the mother had adjusted herself. I expected her to twist her entire body around to face me, but she didn't. Instead, she simply twisted her head. She twisted beyond breaking point. She twisted her head 180 degrees. What was even ghastlier, however, was the face which gazed upon me. It was decomposing. Maggots swam through the cavities in the mother's flesh. Her lipless mouth opened, revealing rotten teeth. She did not smile as she had in the painting. "Where is my son?" her voice cried. To protect itself, my haunted brain had detached from reality. So when the bedroom door slammed shut, I was relieved and petrified in equal measure. I was relieved to be free of the mother's ghoulish gaze, but I was petrified of what I would face next. Remembering why I had come to the Hawthorne house, I resolved to keep searching for Pippa and the boys. I didn't know what kind of demonic specter that I had just seen in the bedroom, and I didn't want to know. Standing in the upstairs hallway, desperately trying to catch my breath, I became aware of a squelching sound. I cast my phone torch onto the wall behind me. A black liquid of unknown composition had scrawled 3 direful words. "Father is home." Moving my light onto the paintings, I saw Bert and Sarah in their portraits. The third painting, on the other hand, was merely a blank canvas. Jonathan had left his portrait. I heard the front door open and slam shut. Loud footsteps moved with immense speed and purpose, clunking up the stairs. Crying in utterly primal fear, I ran towards the far end of the landing. I opened the final door on the left, hearing floorboards groan beneath the weight of some hulking and monstrous entity. For a split second before I stepped through the open doorway, I caught a glimpse of something in the glow of my phone light. The father was far taller and wider than he had appeared in the flashbacks. His gargantuan, ghostly form could barely squeeze through the upstairs corridor. His decomposing face was much like that of his wife, but his eyes were bloody spheres in his sockets. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. There was a cacophony of fist pounding on the door. The father said nothing. His fury spoke far louder than words. I found myself in a second bedroom, Bert's bedroom, heart still not slowing. The frights did not cease. "Jake," a disembodied girl's voice hissed. I froze. "It's Pippa," she continued. "We're in the hideaway. We've been here for months." "Where's the hideaway?" I asked. The banging on the bedroom door had finally quieted. Pippa whispered again. "Behind the wardrobe. Hurry, I think they heard me." I found the wardrobe on the left-hand wall and I started to push it to the side. It was surprisingly light. Once it was a few feet to the right, a small opening was revealed in the wall behind it. I couldn't see anything inside the darkened doorway, but I had to press forwards. I used my phone to light the way and I found myself ascending a small set of stairs. Of course, the attic with the oval window. I tentatively clambered up the staircase, keeping my eyes and ears keenly peeled for anything untoward. When I reached the top, I stretched my hand towards the door handle before me. Creaking, an icy breath skirted across my left ear. Something was standing on the step behind me. "They murdered him," a voice groaned. I didn't need to turn my head. I knew that it was the mother. Quivering, I lightly pressed the standby button to switch off the screen. On the dark, glassy surface of my phone, I saw the walking corpse of the half-decaying mother standing just behind me. Her gaunt face was illuminated by my torchlight. I screamed in terror, but I was quickly silenced by a gnarled, bony hand that clasped over my mouth. That only made me scream louder. I shook the creature off me, whirled around, and she was gone. Too frightened to spend another minute in this house of nightmares, I proceeded to repeatedly slam my shoulder into the attic door. Finally, it gave way. I cast the phone light into the attic, expecting to be met with emptiness, but I turned to the right to find myself looking upon 4 malnourished children who were shivering beneath the oval window. The world outside remained an endless void, but that was besides the point. I had done it. I had found the girl who had been trapping me in the loop for thousands of years, and it hadn't been a fruitless endeavor. The children were crying incessantly. "I'm so sorry," Pippa said. "I was just so scared. Can you help us leave this place?" "We didn't mean to do it," one of the boys whimpered. "The voices made us lock her in here," another boy added. The third boy simply nodded, seemingly too traumatized to speak. "Okay," I eventually managed to say. "Do any of you know something that could help us escape?" Their eyes widened. "You don't know how to free us?" one of the boys shakily asked. I didn't respond. My mind was worrying. I thought about everything that Harold had told me, and then I realized that I didn't need his help. I needed the help of the people who had created the shrine. "Sarah," I screamed. "Jonathan." "What are you doing?" Pippa asked, horrified. "We need to get away from them." Before I could reply, the wall at the far end of the attic had started to ripple, like swimmers coming to the surface of a pool. The dreadful mother and father seeped through the torn wallpaper. The children screeched, but I stood my ground, keeping the torchlight on the horrible abominations that were striding towards us. "Is your son buried in the front garden?" I asked. No reply. The emotionless demons looked upon me with their awful eyes. "If you create a bridge back to the real world, I could return him to you. That's what you want, isn't it?" The mother started to walk towards me, and I trembled in immobilizing terror. "He should be here with us," she wheezed. "Open the bridge," I repeated. "You can't leave the house, can you? I can return his bones to you. I can give you peace. But you must return all of us to our rightful places on our rightful timelines." The ghouls stared for a long time. The only sound in that haunted room was the blubbering of the 4 children who were hiding behind me. I received my answer in the form of light pouring into the room. Not light from my phone, light from the oval window. I and the children turned to face the real world. Fireworks filled the sky. As we watched with teary eyes, the children dissipated. The outside world in turn rapidly changed. The sun rose and set thousands of times in a matter of seconds. Years were passing by. When the earth eventually slowed, I knew that it was 2022 again. "Return our son," the father wheezed. When I turned to face them, the terrifying entities were gone. I sprinted down these stairs from the attic, bounded across to Bert's bedroom, flung my panicked body along the hallway, and started to sprint down the main staircase. Gliding across the hallway towards the open door, I prepared to taste freedom. Scorching agony. Horrified, I found myself engulfed in darkness before being thrown onto the floor of the hallway. I bellowed in pain, feeling a searing sensation across my skin. "No!" I whined in horror. The glassy-eyed man. He was standing on the front porch, obstructing what seemed to be the only exit from this house of tricks. He was little more than a shadow, filling the doorway with his black form and white pinpricks. "I fixed it," I yelled. "The loop is over." No response came from the inhuman entity, no movement. I checked the time on my phone. 11:02 p.m. "It's after 11 o'clock and I've not reset," I explained exasperately. "The loop is over." After an eternal moment, the shadow faded into the blackness. The glassy pinpricks merged with the night sky, joining a canopy of twinkling stars. My strained heart finally loosened. Gingerly, I attempted to leave the house. I took a step onto the porch. Nothing stopped me. I hurried into the front yard and tore at the grass with my bare hands. Dirt under my half-broken nails, I quickly dug my way to the cluster of bones that the Hawthorne parents had buried. Why did they not keep the bones in the house? Did they ever manage to resurrect their son? Why were their souls trapped in the 11th shrine with their son's murderers? So many unanswered questions. I delicately and respectfully placed the pile of bones inside the main hallway, quickly exiting the Hawthorne house. As I tiptoed backwards, keeping my eye on the open front door, I saw a bony hand stretch across the wooden floor and drag Bert's remnants out of view. As I passed through the gate, the door to the Hawthorne house swung shut. That was 15 minutes ago, and I hope beyond all hope to never reopen that terrible chapter of my life. At this very moment, I find myself sitting on the curb, typing my update and staring vacantly at the swarm of partygoers. They're blissfully unaware of the horrors lurking in the abhorrent building just behind me. 11:22 p.m. I've never lived beyond 11 p.m. on December 31st, 2022. That must be a promising sign. I'm free, surely. At 11 p.m., I didn't wake up in 1999. Pippa must have released me. But as the Hawthorne house released me, as the glassy-eyed man released me, I suppose that I'll never have a definite answer. I'll always wince in terror at the sight of cavernous crevices. I'll always be looking for those white eyes. I cannot conquer the unknown, but that's not my battle. After thousands of years, I would simply settle for seeing January 1st, 2023. At midnight, let's hope that I manage to post a comment. Now that Mom and Dad are gone, I need to tell the truth about Jamie. I swore that I would take the secret to my grave. That was before the accident, though. Their car crashed on Saturday, see? Exactly a year to the day since Simon Kincaid got fried in the electric chair. I thought keeping the truth to myself, sparing my folks the agony of the truth was the right thing to do. That was a terrible, terrible mistake. I can't sleep unless I know somebody else knows what really happened. I'm not looking for forgiveness, atonement, or even freedom from your judgment. I can't carry the secrets anymore. Jamie is, or rather was, my older brother. A fair bit older too, 5 years. I was 100% the little sister that only existed to save a marriage. It worked by and by. Mom and Dad bounced back from borderline divorce when I was born, and they were together right up until their Honda Civic plowed off that bridge. For a while, we actually had the perfect family. And then came the day that Jamie told me about the hole. I was 12, he was 17, both nearing our birthdays. It was summer and a hot one at that. 104 on the mercury when we grabbed our bikes to ride out to the hole. Jamie had found it earlier in the week when he and his idiot friends were quad biking the trails in Herbert's Woods. Unbeknownst to Jamie, they had also been only half a mile away from the outdoor encampment of off-grid paranoid shut-in Simon Kincaid. This alone was enough to seal his fate. When he first found the hole, Jamie didn't have the gear that he took to the indoor climbing place every other weekend. That's why he wanted to come back with me a week later, to climb down it. I pointed out to him that a hole in the forest isn't the same as an indoor climbing wall with safety fall mattresses and instructors, and he told me to shut up and stop being a butt munch. I still miss him. I would give anything to hear him call me any one of those dozens of 90s playground insults again. It was an hour of solid cycling before we reached the hole. I had never been that deep into Herbert's Woods before. Not that I knew it in that blistering summer afternoon, but I would never again either. Well, that's not technically true. I did go back once, to show the police and my frantic parents where I had last seen Jamie. Jamie's idiot friends, Ben and Adam, were waiting for us with Adam's truck. The beaten and rusted 88 Comanche was essential for Jamie's plan to explore the depths of the hole. The pickup's tow bar would act as an anchor for the rope, and Adam and Ben would pick up the spare slack cord, using it to lower Jamie down by hand. My role in his scheme was being there because Mom and Dad were at work, so Jamie was saddled with me for the day and had to include me whether he wanted to or not. If I wanted to look back with rose-tinted glasses, I could say Jamie also thought it could be a brother-sister bonding experience. I know deep down that that's not true though. I also don't deserve the privilege of viewing that say through any lens other than the stark, harrowing truth. I was nervous even before we got deep into the forest. Herbert's Woods had a reputation in the schoolyards of our small town, had done for generations. Murderers lived in Herbert's Woods, didn't you know? So said the various classroom rhymes and playground songs at least. Any local kid could tell you about the sprawling miles of towering evergreens, and how they were home to escaped lunatics from the St. Dionysus mental institution a few miles out of town, near the larger settlement of Marathon. I was too old to admit that I still believed in the urban legends, but not old enough to be unspooked as the trees and shadows around the dirt path grew thicker and thicker. I had to keep convincing myself the noises that I could hear coming from the dense undergrowth and rustling foliage had normal, wholesome, nature documentary explanations. For the first time in my life, I was actually grateful to see my older brother's two idiot sidekicks. It was early evening and the canopy of tree branches overhead was thick enough to mute the dwindling sunlight to near darkness. The glare of the 88 Comanche's headlights was a welcome reprieve as far as my preteen resolve was concerned. Not that I let Jamie or his moronic adolescent stooges see this, of course. When Ben asked if I was scared, I gave him the finger. Then Jamie punched him on the arm and knocked the can of beer out of his hand, which was nice. The last big brotherly thing you ever did. Ben and Adam were thick as the gnarled trunks and roots surrounding us, but Jamie was smart. He had brought along plenty of rope and flashlights and even a set of walkie-talkies. After I informed him that I would tell Mom he brought me along to Herbert's Woods too if he didn't, Jamie agreed to let me be the radio operator while the other two lowered him. He had his longest rope about 80 meters. He explained before showing me the hole that their flashlight beams didn't reach the bottom, but a stone they chucked down there had hit solid ground. Jamie refused to disclose how long it took for the echo of the stone landing to drift back up to the surface. He assured me it couldn't be any deeper than 30 to 50 meters though. When I asked him how he had figured that out, he told me to shut up. That's how. My first question when I finally saw the hole was why on earth Jamie wanted to climb down it. My second was if there was anything I could do to stop him. There wasn't. My bluff of threatening to actually tell Mom this time was countered with a do-it-then turd wipe. He knew that I wouldn't. I was his 12-year-old little sister. I was too young to rebel of my own accord, but old enough to want my rebellious teenage brother to think that I was cool. That's why I gulped and took the walkie-talkie from his hand, instead of convincing him to come down from the literal ledge as I should have. The hole didn't look natural. It wasn't a sinkhole or the entrance to a cave system. About 7 feet in diameter, the perfect circle was a sheer drop into murky nothingness. It lay about a 5-second walk from the dirt track, in a small clearing. Adam and Ben had spent all day clearing through bushes to get the trek as close as possible to the rim, although their efforts had done little to detract from how cramped and claustrophobic this patch of bare earth and the near solid blanket of trees felt. Jamie was right about the hole being deep too. My flashlight revealed nothing but more darkness when I pointed it over the smooth lip of the hole. As I said, perfect vertical drop. The earth and dirt of the walls were compressed so tightly that it looked more like clay. Shaft is perhaps a more appropriate word now that I think about it. Actually, no. Shaft sounds too innocent. It was a hole. a gaping, yawning abyss staring back at you whole. Why did Jamie want to climb down it? Because it was there and because he could. And as far as my 12-year-old self was concerned, because boys were stupid. Jamie was one of those kids though. Mom and Dad had gotten him into indoor rock climbing as an outlet after, well, a few incidents of trespassing on quote-unquote abandoned factories that nearly got him a record. If we had been born 20 years later, he would have had an Urbex channel on YouTube. By his reckoning, the hole might be an old well with a dead body from pioneer times at the bottom, or it might be the entrance to an unfinished nuclear bunker. Either of these near certainties would be, in his exact words, as cool as Satan taking a dump on a Metallica meets Iron Maiden mashup album cover. That was enough justification for Jamie, and I had learned very early in my childhood that there was little point arguing once he started making weirdly specific 80s metal references. After getting harnessed up, Jamie instructed me to go and wait by Adam's truck. Because of our near constant sibling bickering, he was visibly surprised when I didn't argue. I told him in no uncertain terms that the hole creeped me out. Jamie called me a baby and then Ben decided to join in. Difference is, the two words that Ben chose to call me began with a P and a B, and definitely weren't words Jamie could stomach hearing directed at his little sister. That's the exact moment life as I blissfully knew it ended. Jamie saw red, but Ben had been standing on the other side of the 7-foot hole out of punching range. My older brother did the first thing next his suddenly enraged mind could think of. He picked up the heaviest fallen tree branch within arm's reach and hurled it at Ben, a direct hit. Jamie could bench 100 pounds and he grunted when he picked up that log. It wasn't light. It was no surprise at all that Ben went cross-eyed when the wood had bounced off of his head, especially when a thin red river immediately began pouring from the fresh wound just above his hairline. I didn't start screaming at Jamie because of the blood. I started because when Ben's knees buckled, he swayed, turning in the air mid-collapse, and fell straight into the hole. As Jamie pointed out after the 5 minutes it took to calm me down, my wailing meant that we didn't hear Ben hit the bottom. He could have gotten stuck though, he could be fine. But the only way to know would be if Jamie went down the hole. My brother was absolutely positive about that. To Jamie's credit, even though there were tears in his eyes and he was clearly terrified, he didn't think twice about jumping into the yawning void to rescue his friend. He also immediately took responsibility for his mess-up, as evidenced by his lack of retaliation when Adam had knocked the wind out of him with a gut punch. The three of them went all the way back to kindergarten. I think that's why Adam stayed instead of jumping straight into his truck and going to the police. He knew Jamie and he knew that Jamie had never intended to actually hurt Ben, let alone possibly kill him. He also knew that Jamie's aim wasn't that great. The chances that the log had hit Ben's head for any reason other than sheer fluke were slim. Jamie had royally screwed up, but Adam wouldn't snitch on him. At least not until they tried to rescue Ben, or, although none of us said it out loud, had confirmed he was dead. And so Jamie was lowered into the hole by Adam as planned. Now though, the stakes were much higher than a simple testosterone-fueled desire to explore dark forbidden spaces for no reason. Face covered in tears and still sniveling, I took my place leaning against the hood of the truck. My knuckles were white tight around the walkie-talkie. Even all these decades later, I can still clearly remember how much I prayed in my head that the knot around the tow bar would hold. I almost begged Jamie not to lower himself any further once everything below his navel had vanished from sight. Almost made one last attempt to stop my brother from descending down that smooth, perfectly circular chasm. I almost, but I didn't. Instead, I gave a final loud sniffle while I watched Adam let loose more of the rope to help Jamie disappear into the earth. My brother caught my eye as he abseiled the last few inches with his head still above ground. when all that remained was his nose, brow, and hair. He actually found enough composure to throw me a reassuring nod. Before I could return it, though, he was gone. My heart was getting its first experience of real intense cardio, the kind of stuff that soccer moms paid $200 a month on spin classes to achieve. I kept having to convince myself that my fears Jamie wouldn't reemerge from the hole were just that. Just fears. Me being a baby. Because that's who I was in all of this. I was Jamie's baby sister. My palms were moist, but nowhere near as wet as my tear-stained cheeks. I managed not to scream again, though. For a little while longer, at least. If I had known just how accurately prophetic my apprehension was, however, I would have opened my mouth and let forth a howl so loud every bird in Wisconsin would be shaken from their trees. I didn't know, though, did I? I still trusted my cool older brother's almost genuine bravado. That's why instead of screaming, I did as instructed and spoke to him on the walkie-talkie. He abseiled down the hole slowly, despite every second counting if Ben had any hope of being recovered alive. This was the very early 90s, remember, no cell phones. As dumb as Jamie's rescue attempt was, it was still a faster bet than trying to find a payphone. The first 4 to 5 minutes were filled mostly with Jamie rambling to keep himself focused. He apologized over and over to me, to Adam, to Ben, to Mom and Dad. It was all that he could do not to spiral into a panic attack at the realization that he may have just caused the death of one of his closest friends. There was more than one. Man, I'll be facing hard time for this. I'm gonna die behind bars. Moment too. I tried my best to hide my sobs and sound calm when I responded, but I don't think it did much good. I wasn't calm. I was in shock, weak-kneed, and on the verge of puking. I also found it difficult to placate Jamie's worries when my older brother's assessment was pretty much bang on the money. He had possibly killed Ben. He would more than likely face jail time for murder. Every "it'll be okay" was a massive lie, and the increasing tempo of the ragged breast between his words confirmed to me that he knew it. Ben's fall happened so fast. Our day went from building childhood memories to birthing lifelong trauma in the blink of an eye. Jamie's descent was equally traumatic as Ben's tumble, but it was anything but instant. Every second listening to his cracking voice in the handset felt like a lifetime long. I don't know which I prayed harder for in my head, that the rope wrapped around the rusty tow bar held, or that Adam's teenage arms didn't buckle under the strain. Both worst-case scenarios looked imminent more than once. Every creak of Adam's truck made me yelp. Every groan that he made twisted a fresh knot in my gut. When the worst did eventually happen, none of my foreboding predictions prepared me for it. I wasn't even close. Some conversations stick with you clear as crystal no matter how many years pass. My final one with Jamie before the hole took him hasn't faded even a fraction of a percent, despite 30 years having gone since. How far down are you now, idiot? I sniffled into the receiver, not knowing that it would be the last question he would ever answer. About 55 meters, I think. Came Jamie's hiss-pop feedback-heavy response. I thought that I would be at the bottom by now. I told you that it was deeper than you thought, idiot. I laughed wildly into the walkie-talkie, trying and failing not to show how far from funny I found the situation. Jamie's return attempt was just as pathetic. Well, maybe if you knew how to talk at a human pitch, my ears could hear your words. You helium huffing You can hear me now, idiot. And then I couldn't hold it in any longer. Jamie, I'm scared. Please tell Adam to pull you back up. He's running out of slack rope. I want to go home. What's happening down there? Are you... Shh. My babbling was cut off by a sharp hiss from the walkie-talkie. Shut up, dingus. I think I found the bottom. Yeah, I found the bottom. Sure enough, the rope in Adam's hand had gone from Golden Gate Bridge support cable taut to wriggling at the lip of the hole like a beached earthworm. Adam immediately sunk to his knees when the tension of Jamie's weight had released, face red and veiny arms limp. He didn't let go of the rope though. A fatal error. The crackling voice of Jamie didn't stop either. There's a big like a cave or something down here, but it's like square. Jamie, what's going on down there? I yelled at the black box in my hand. Can you see? Ben? The walkie-talkie said. Ben, are you down here? Crap, man, it's so dark. This flashlight isn't doing anything. Ben. Jamie, what's happening? Have you found? My tear-choked questioning was cut off by a loud, shrill, microphone feedback pitch scream. Jamie's scream. It didn't come from the walkie-talkie, though. It came from the hole. Jamie! I yelled again, both at the hole and the walkie-talkie clenched tight in my sweaty grip. Jamie, are you hurt? Jamie, talk to me. Pull me up! I found Ben, oh God. I found Ben, pull me up. He's open. I can see his... tell Adam to pull me up right now. There was a long pause during which I could hear nothing but static. I kept yelling Jamie's name, but just before I nodded to Adam to start pulling him up, my older brother's voice returned on the radio waves. It was a single word. Wait. Jamie noticed something that snapped him out of his overwhelming panic spiral. I didn't have to ask what. It's Ben. He didn't survive the fall. No, duh, he didn't, but there's a lot of blood. He died when he hit the ground. I can see where he landed. But it's not where he is. There's a trail like something dragged his body over. And then the second scream came from the hole. This one wasn't Jamie. It wasn't even human. The pitch of the half-snarl, half-shriek that geysered from the wound in the earth oscillated far too fast to be human. I would say the second scream was bestial, animalistic, but even that doesn't feel right. Growing up in a small, semi-rural town surrounded by woodlands, you get used to animal sounds. Some are frightening, sure, and many conjure images of unspeakable nightmares when heard by unaccustomed ears. No animal that I have ever heard, even the ones that were fighting, screwing, or dying, made noises that sounded like that second scream. It was so loud, a horde of cawing birds swarmed from the tree canopy into the orange sunset beyond, like they knew this thing that we had disturbed wasn't of the forest, and their mocking crowing was a big old, I told you so. The abyssal screaming from the hole lasted a full 10 seconds. Probably doesn't sound that long to you reading this as mere pathetic words on a screen. But you weren't there. You don't know. If someone told me Adam and I stood there listening to that ragged shrieking for an entire century, I would have believed them. I only realized how hard I had been clenching my jaw and fist during the howl by how much they suddenly hurt when it stopped. The silence that followed felt almost as long as the maddening roar itself. Then, from the walkie-talkie, came the last words I ever heard my brother say. Don't tell Mom I brought you with me. Tell her I snuck out. I shouldn't have. Whatever he had seen down there, whatever had screamed at him in the darkness at the bottom of the hole, it had left him in a state of instant, detached, disassociative shock. For comparison, even the sight of his best friend's body, a body that he himself created, didn't destroy Jamie's psyche as fully and totally as whatever his flashlight was revealing. I didn't know whether this is fortunate or unfortunate, but he didn't live long enough to tell me what it was. The rope dangling over the lip of the hole sprang back into iron rod tightness. Jamie's voice on the headset was ripped into static near silence by a short and sharp burst of ringing feedback. Adam, his blistered hand still wrapped tight around the rope, lurched forward and over the edge of the pit. I finally let myself scream that bird-disturbing scream that I mentioned. Too bad the crows had already had the sense to flee. It was chaos, and all of it happened at the same moment. Before I could make sense of any of it though, the truck that I'd been leaning against was pulled toward the hole by the rope, just like its owner. Since I had had all my weight against it, I was pushed violently by the sudden shift of the 3-ton vehicle. I fell forward, the smooth, clayish lip of the darkness rushing toward me. I closed my eyes, awaiting the spray of air whistling past my face. I heard the twang of the last of the rope getting sucked into the hole, and I realized that Adam had already been yanked to his doom by the same impossibly strong pull from the other end. The pole that was using the climbing rope to reel in the rusted pickup truck like a sea bass. In the slowed down, adrenaline time of my fall, my expectations went from the pressing rush of plummeting into the void like Jamie, Adam, and Ben, to feeling the crush of the truck pinning my body into the earth. Neither horrifying sensation came. Instead, before I knew what it was, I felt the grip of a hand on my shoulder. Simon Kincaid's fate was sealed the moment that he decided to set up his makeshift off-grid encampment in Herbert's Woods. If he had chosen to live on any of the other million square miles of unclaimed wilderness, he wouldn't have been close enough for the police to pin everything on him. He also might not have been close enough to hear the almost alien scream from the hole. He definitely wouldn't have been close enough for his evening jog to bring him along the same dirt path that Adam's truck was fiercely wrenched from, at the exact moment that it was wrenched. And of course, it goes without saying that I would with absolute certainty be dead right now if Herbert's Woods hadn't felt homely to Simon Kincaid when he was seeking a new place to live barely 6 months earlier. Simon Kincaid has saved my life and he paid for it with his own. I've had to learn to live with that this past year. Honestly, I'm not sure how much longer I can. If it wasn't for me, he would have never had Jamie's blood on his hands, both in the eyes of the law and literally. I was near thrown out of the way of the truck just in time. Instead of plummeting into the hole, I landed in a sobbing heap beside it. There was a loud, final crunch from the rusted tow bar, but amazingly it held. This crunch of defiant steel was accompanied by a last twanging from the rope before it felt still and lifeless. My memories start to get hazy after this. I remember pointing at the hole, remember screaming, my brother," over and over again. I remember the dirty, borderline homeless hero who had saved my life, retracting the worryingly slack cord from the circular void. What do I remember the most, though? Obviously, what I remember most is the dark red liquid dripping from the torn end when the last of the dangling length was finally pulled into the daylight, considerably less than 80 meters later. I barfed when I saw it, all over Simon Kincaid, which is how my DNA got on his clothes. Handling the blood-soaked rope was how he got Jamie's. The cycle ride home has always been a blur, even as it was happening. So were the various police interviews or conversations with my parents in the weeks and months that followed. I didn't stop to speak to Simon Kincaid or even thank him. I just wanted my mom. Unfortunately for Mr. Kincaid, he would wake up the next day to find a SWAT team surrounding his trailer in the forest, the barrels of their guns all aimed directly at him. From that day on, he would never be a free man again. I was there when they gave him the chair. I thought that I owed him that much. For him to die with somebody who knew the truth present. Someone to validate his innocence as he entered the next life. He didn't agree when he saw me through the glass. I've never heard anyone swear like that. When I led them to the clearing, the circular chasm had vanished. All that remained was a patch of condensed, almost clay-like earth. One that none of the officers seemed to want to look at for too long. However, a bit of ground that gives people heebie-jeebies is hardly admissible evidence in court, since there was no hole anymore when the police found Adam's truck, Nobody believed my story. When I realized the cops, my parents, Adam's mom, and especially Ben's town councilman father wanted to believe that Simon Kincaid had killed the 3 boys, I started agreeing with, what have I done? I've had 30 years to try and rectify this. Nobody believed Simon Kincaid's story either. Until the day that he died, he was a guilty, monstrous, evil individual in the eyes of literally everybody but me. Nobody believed this weirdo forest dweller had found me without my brother and his idiot friends, let alone that he would quote-unquote saved me from a hole that, quote-unquote, mysteriously couldn't be found. Or at least that's how the skeptic law enforcement officials and jury sarcastically saw it, when he refused to stop pleading his innocence. I could have corroborated his story, but instead Look, I was 12, okay? I was surrounded by furious adults who needed vindication, not inexplicable, not vanishing forest holes. Ben's dad screamed at me so much about Kincaid being a killer, about Kincaid doing some messed up stuff that had traumatized me, about being so traumatized that I would wipe it from my memory and swapped it for a fantasy that I believed it. For years I convinced myself that justice had been served, that forest weirdo Simon Kincaid had killed my brother and his 2 idiot pals. I couldn't ignore the daily nightmares about the hole, or the scream that came from it forever though. I ended up having an okay I had a life, a crappy job in data science and a failed marriage that was too short to produce kids, a cat. Not much, but more than Simon Kincaid ever got. Through it all, I had the nightmares to remind me that my empire of mediocrity was built on a fatal lie. It was the mid-2010s when I finally broke and admitted the truth to myself. I decided not to tell Mom and Dad. I wanted to spare them the pain. It had been years since Jamie's casketless funeral. Why open old wounds, I figured. Either they would think that I had gone mad or they would believe me and want to head back to Wisconsin for answers. Both options involved nothing but emotional pain. I couldn't do that to them, although now I wish that I would have found the strength to. The guilt at knowing they died ignorant of Jamie's true fate is tearing me apart, almost as much as what I did to Simon Kincaid with my silence. As I said, I'm not posting this to find absolution. I don't deserve forgiveness. I did a terrible thing, and I have to live with that fact and own it. I ran from my trauma for years, wrapped myself in the comforts of a reality I knew to be false, and an innocent man had died for it. At least I don't have to carry this as a secret anymore. Mom and Dad, I might be gone, but someone else knows what really happened that day. You, by the way, I'm talking about you, the person listening to this. Who knows, maybe now I've told you the nightmares will finally stop. I hope so. This was the first idea on my list, and I'm really not looking forward to Plan B. Plan A, posting this, hinges on the fact that my nightmares are because of the guilt. If they're not, well, crap. I'm really not looking forward to Plan B. I haven't been back to Herbert's Woods since I led the police to Adam's 88 Comanche in the clearing where the hole had been. Somehow I know if I return alone this time, I'll find it again. Deep down in my bones, I know. I don't want to test the theory though, but if these nightmares don't stop, that's the next step. What else can I do? I need to make it right. Maybe that means finding the bodies. Man, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. She winked and swirled her cocktail. I'm what you might call a search and rescue tourist. Huh? I was sure that I hadn't heard her over the jazz piano and muffled bar conversations around us. No, you heard right. She leaned in close. Come on, what do you see in the news every day? The worst side of people. Crime, corruption, selfishness. But when someone goes missing, you should see it. The whole community comes together. What are you talking about? I got certified in search and rescue years ago, and now I go wherever there's a need. Look, I've struggled with depression my whole life. Most of the time it feels like the planet is doomed. Life isn't worth living, and things are only getting worse. But when you're out there looking for somebody, sharing hugs and hot coffee, and candlelight vigils, it feels like there's actually hope. I mean, you might actually be the one to rescue a person who would otherwise disappear without a trace, or solve an unexplained mystery. Isn't that better than a hangover, a sunburn, and an overpriced motel? How well I remember that fateful conversation. All I'd wanted was to plan a trip with my new girlfriend, Roxanne. We had only been dating for a few weeks, and we were still sort of feeling each other out, trying to see if this thing would be a good fit. That's why I was so surprised that she mentioned her little secret. One of many as it turned out, but that was later. And back in the cocktail bar, I was still puppy love infatuated with the geeky, unpredictable redhead across the table from me. And if she had said that her hobby was bear wrestling or digging up corpses, I probably would have gone along just as eagerly. Just like a hiker wandering off the trail or a child swimming too deep, I was entering an uncharted world where what I knew no longer applied. That's how I found myself in a tacky pine-scented cabin in Halleck's Point, Wyoming, buttoning up to go look for Bryce Hartford. Bryce was 7 years old and 52 hours missing. Bryce's mother, Carmen, had been watching him build a snow fort in the backyard when she realized that she had left her phone inside. When Carmen returned, all that was left of Bryce was a small blue mitten hanging from the handle of a plastic shovel. Her son was gone. On the drive out to Halleck's Point, Roxanne explained to me that the families of the disappeared almost always respond in the same way, beginning with denial. Bryce must have just gone around front or come around the front door, Carmen supposes. Maybe he was even hiding on purpose. She searches the whole house before moving on to worry. Carmen starts screaming Bryce's name, searching the ankle-deep snow and skeletal trees behind her house until their footprints crisscross the undergrowth. She makes calls to neighbors, her wife Abby, and finally the police, whose gloomy warnings inspire panic. Dusk turns the woods blue. Officers, reporters, well-wishers, and rubberneckers come and go from the kitchen. Carmen sobs into her tea while Abby rubs her shoulders, and the mustachioed police officers questions about unusual strangers around the house or personal enemies lead to paranoia. Carmen and Abby stare sleeplessly at the ceiling, wondering who on earth could wish evil on their sweet little boy. Overnight, rumors spread like wildfire through the small town. The outpouring of public support the next day gives the desperate family a bit of hope. Maybe Bryce just got lost in the woods. Carmen and Abby's property is bordered on 3 sides by the National Forest after all. And surely with all these searches and thermal imaging helicopters and handmade posters all over town, Bryce will be found, right? That hope had mostly faded by the chilly morning of our search. These searchers who had stopped through the nearby forest and sipped donated hot cocoa were a lot less eager after 2 days of finding nothing. The icy rain didn't help, and neither did the fact that the extended search entered areas that were truly remote. The cliffs out there had an eerie, watchful quality, glowering down on the volunteers while they fought icy thorn bushes and swampy mock. When Roxanne and I pulled up to the dirt lot at the end of the forest road, each searcher's face told the same sad story. There's no way that kid is still alive. What on earth are we still doing here? We didn't say where we had come from. Carmen didn't ask. I felt like an imposter when she forced a little smile and squeezed her hands in thanks. Carmen handed us each a photo of the brown-haired, freckly, gap-toothed boy in a red parka and a gray knit cap, and blue mittens as well. And then she wished luck to our sad little band. Roxanne and I, Samir and Devin, professional search and rescue agents, and the local deputy, Amos Hartford, with his knee-high boots, Smokey the bear hat, and grizzled beard. Amos looked like he had just walked out of a 60s western. "Alright folks, I want a clean, thorough search. It's bad country out there, ridges, caves, valleys, easy to get turned around. Y'all make sure that you stay in sight of the searchers on either side. If you look around and don't see the next in line, blow your whistle. Then we'll pause and regroup. If you find anything or have a problem, same thing, blow the whistle. Remember, we're going a long way off the beaten track today. Lots of people go missing out there every year." Amos took a deep breath. "But we find most of them. Let's not give up hope. Move out." Roxanne had insisted that I complete a training course, but what I found at Halleck's Point was nothing like it. The icy woods were too quiet, and this was no simulation. That boy might really be out there. Our lonely voices echoed from the cliffs, and I realized that I was spending more time trying not to get separated from the group than actively searching for traces of Bryce. The forest was riddled with narrow crevices full of leaves and slippery cliffs. It was all I could do to keep my footing, and each step made it obvious that if a 7-year-old fell out here, he would never be found. The first time I looked to my left and didn't see Roxanne in her bright orange vest, I panicked. Not for her, I'm ashamed to say, but for me. Although I told myself that I was keeping track of our position, the truth was that I had no idea how to get back to the forest road, and I was already sniffling and shivering despite my winter clothing. If I got left out here after nightfall. I heard 4 other whistles answer my call. Like magic, Roxanne and Samir appeared among the boulders up ahead. I had simply blundered into a shallow ravine that blocked visibility on both sides. Roxanne looked disappointed, Samir looked worried, and I looked like a fool. Roxanne and Samir said that it was fine and that I had done the right thing, and although I'm sure they sincerely meant it, I was furious with myself. I had cost us and Bryce precious time. I resolved not to do it again. Until I separated myself from the group again, not even an hour later. I had a good excuse, or at least I thought I did. A rustling came from the bushes ahead, and I'd swear that I saw the flash of a child-sized red parka and a gray knit cap disappear into the reeds of the swamp. I forgot all about my whistle. I gave chase. "Bryce!" I yelled as we had been yelling all day. I smacked away bushes, fought to unstick my boots from the marshy ground, and finally slipped into the mud as I vaulted over a rotten log. By the time that I had straggled back to where I was supposed to be, the others seemed to have been swallowed up by the cliffs. I called for Roxanne's name. I ran forward and then back until I realized that I was only getting myself more lost and time was running out. I blushed when I blew the whistle for the second time that day. Everyone came running, even Deputy Amos and Devin from the far ends of the line. None of them said so, but I could tell they all felt annoyed and let down. "Welp," Deputy Amos spat. "Might as well break for lunch then." We settled onto the cold rocks to eat our cold sandwiches in a cold wind, and for the most part, we ate in silence except for Roxanne. Her conversation with Deputy Amos sounded more like an interrogation, and a few parts stuck out to me later. "You must not be used to this," Roxanne sighed. "Halleck's Point seems like such a quiet little town." "Yeah," Amos grunted. Mostly, huh?" Roxanne pressed. "Trouble in paradise." "Well, this ain't the first kid who's gone missing. There was a girl back in '97, on the other side by the cattle ranches, just vanished into thin air." "Do you think the two are related?" "Why?" Amos finally replied after a long pause. "Do you?" At this, Amos gave us both a long, hard look. It felt like there was a warning in those flinting eyes. "Where did you say y'all was from again?" Back on our sore feet, we continued deeper into the woods. A few hours later, however, something more than blisters was bothering me. It wasn't just that we had gone further than any 7-year-old could reasonably have gone on his own, or Deputy Amos's unsettling story about the missing girl from all those years ago. It was the time of day. Dusk came early in those broken hills. We should have turned back by afternoon, yet Deputy Amos led us silently on, almost like he already knew what we were going to find. Lost in such troubling thoughts, I didn't hear the whistles right away. Not just one, but 3 of them. I stood dumbly for a moment, not realizing what the shrill sound might mean. Boulders blocked my line of sight. Roxanne came running up from my left, asking what was going on. The whistling became even more desperate and disjointed, and then it suddenly stopped. By the time that Roxanne and I scrambled up to the ridge, all sound and movement on our right had ceased. It was as though Evan, Samir, and Deputy Amos had been swallowed up by the forest. We called their names, blew our own whistles, and swept the area. To no avail, though. I asked Roxanne what she thought had happened. I asked if anything like this had ever happened during her other search and rescue tourist experiences, but Roxanne wasn't paying attention to me. Her eyes were fixed on a GPS in her hand, a GPS that even I could see was malfunctioning. With a frown, she returned the GPS to her backpack, and then took out a waterproof bag holding a map of the area, a compass, and some fire starters. Roxanne apparently came well prepared. What do we do in a situation like this? I wondered aloud. Roxanne's expression was inscrutable as she surveyed the cliff top across the valley. We go back. It only took a few minutes for me to be stunned into silence by my girlfriend's unexplained talents. Apparently, there was a lot more to using a compass than pointing it north, and a lot more to maps than X marks the spot. Gorges and rocky slopes prevented us from moving in anything like a straight line, but I never doubted that Roxanne was leading us back home, just not quickly enough. After a few more hours of trudging, it became clear that we would be spending the night in the woods. We made camp in a small clearing, using headlamps for light, and we foraged for firewood and built a small lean-to from fallen logs. We dug out the bottom and used leaves and dirt for insulation. Roxanne seemed pretty on edge. She jumped at every snapping twig or rustle in the frosty undergrowth. I could understand being worried in a situation like ours, but Roxanne wasn't acting like a person who was lost. She was acting like a person being hunted. Roxanne didn't relax until the fire was lit, and she let out a deep sigh as the crackling flames warmed her boots. There was something about the orange glow that cheered me up as well. Wrapped up in Roxanne's emergency thermal blanket, with hot rocks warming our shelter, and a starry sky overhead, the whole thing felt like a big adventure. Surely we would be back in town tomorrow and a larger team would find Deputy Amos and the others, who must have just gotten separated from us. Maybe they had even found Bryce, and Alex Point probably had some little dive bar where we would all laugh about this later. "Help!" A child's voice called from the darkness. "I'm so cold." I wondered if exhaustion could make a person hallucinate. Surely I hadn't heard. "Help! I'm cold." Roxanne was on her feet in an instant, but she wasn't rushing toward the trees. Instead, she grabbed a flaming branch from the fire and pulled a pistol from the back of her jeans. What the heck was going on? "Bryce!" I shouted back. "Bryce," came the response. "Help, I'm cold." Even with the beam of my headlamp, I couldn't find the source of the voice out in the dark trees. "We've got to get out of here." "Shh." My girlfriend grabbed my arm. "Shut up and stay put, all right?" "Help, please help, I'm cold, I'm so cold." Bryce. The voice came from a few feet behind us, just outside of the firelight. We both spun around, but our shaky headlamps revealed nothing more than bare dirt. Bryce, I shouted. Don't worry, it's gonna be okay. We've been looking for you. We're friends of your mom. Mom, okay. Please help, cold. Please help, I'm cold. Bryce, looking for Mom. What are you doing? Roxanne hissed. That isn't Bryce. Who else could it be? I almost laughed. With my headlamp bobbing, I ran into the trees toward the source of the voice. Wait, Roxanne called, but I wasn't listening. I was following my fantasies into the dark. This was my chance. Instead of being the blundering idiot who had halted the search for nothing 3 times and left the group, I would be the hero who actually found Bryce. More so, I thought, until I had gone so far into the underbrush that our fire was a candle flame in the distance. There was no sign of Bryce or Roxanne, and in the frigid and absolute silence I realized the depths of my mistake. It sounded like 3 gunshots, a strangled cry, and then silence. Panicking, I ran for the fire. Sweat poured down my face despite the chill in my heart felt like it might explode at any moment. I had regained the comforting glow of the flames, but the one who had kindled them was gone. I called for Roxanne until my throat was hoarse, but I didn't dare leave the fire. The next thing I remember was the dawn, pale and gray as the fire's ashes. I stared at them for a while, feeling shell-shocked. I didn't know how to build a fire like that. I didn't know how to read a map, and I didn't have one even if I did. I tried to follow Roxanne's footprints along the frosty ground, but quickly lost the trail. A sea of trees and rocks extended for miles in every direction. If I went the wrong way, I would probably die of exposure or starvation before I reached the edge of the woods. And whatever was going on out here was not natural. Roxanne was gone, and there had been no news of Evan, Samir, and Deputy Amos either. No flare, no helicopter, no cavalry to ride in and save the day. If anyone was going to get me out of this, it was going to be me. I picked up a branch of hardwood, about right for a walking stick and about right for a club. My fingers were numb and I felt better with it in my hand. Since Roxanne had been leading us south, I headed that way as well, hoping I would find a large body of water or a landmark, or something that might lead me home and out of this nightmare. I called out to Roxanne, but my throat was so parched that my shouts sounded more like dry, frostbitten wheezes. What could have happened to her? Had she gone off chasing Bryce or whatever it was in the trees? Had she gotten into some kind of fight? If so, why were there no scuffling footprints, no signs of a struggle? What wasn't I seeing here? The only thing I could think to do was return to Halleck's Point and alert the authorities as soon as possible, and so I trudged on. The temperature dropped with every step, and soon fat white snowflakes fell all around me. Around noon, I reached the bottom of a swampy ravine that I thought I recognized. The jagged cliffs and golden reeds told me that I was no more than an hour's hike from the road, but something was different. A path had been smashed down through the reeds. Someone had been here recently. I was hearing my heartbeat in my ears, but I didn't know what was on the other side of that trampled mock. The reeds and brush rose higher than my head, creating a kind of tunnel. It led to the blackness of a knee-high cave, a cave that opened at the bottom of the cliffs like a toothless grin. Something, I don't know what, made me want to approach silently. No good. Sticks split underfoot with each step. Beside me came a loud crackling, followed by shrieks of 2 birds taking off in the reeds and nothing more. My heart was in my throat. The mouth of the cave ahead had been stuffed with logs, sticks, and leaves. It had been dug out as well. It was a kind of nest. Hello? A voice whimpered from the darkness. Hey there. Please help, I'm so cold. I stopped in my tracks. Why don't you come out of there? I asked, and for some reason, I felt my body tense up, like some long-forgotten instinct was getting me ready to run. Okay. A brown-haired boy in a red parka with a single blue mitten on his hand squirmed out of the cliff face in front of me. He was pale, sniffling, scratched up and scared, but all things considered, he seemed all right. "Bryce," I ventured. The boy nodded. "What happened to you?" "I don't know." Bryce shrugged. He was trembling. "I just want to go home." We stared at each other for a moment, unmoving. Bryce was scoping me out to see if I was safe, and I was doing the same to him. Why was I scared of a 7-year-old boy? The boy's face was stained with dirt and mucus. His lips were almost blue. This couldn't go on. I reached out and grabbed the child's wrist. "Do you know the way home, mister?" "I can't make any promises," I smiled, "but I'll do my best." The child seemed weak, but I was too. He struggled in the thick mud and gravelly cliffs, but I didn't have the strength to carry him. We were both beyond exhaustion when I finally glimpsed the thin line of the dirt forest road, the next valley over. I gave a little wheeze of joy and hurried downhill toward the parked cars below, dragging the child behind me. We had made it. I had more cause for joy than I knew. I wasn't the only searcher who had made it back. Up ahead, I saw a figure in a hunter orange vest and a big brown hat. Deputy Amos. I waved, but his back was to me and my voice was too hoarse to shout. We were atop the final ridge before the road when I finally caught up to him. The sound of the child and I crashing through the undergrowth behind made Amos turn his head. I waved again. "Deputy," I gasped. "I found—" Amos turned slowly, his hand on the pistol at his hip. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. It was what walked beside him. The little figure had been hidden by the deputy's bulk until we got close, but now it was clear. A little brown-haired boy in a red parka with a single blue mitten. The boy whose hand I held stopped dead and grabbed my wrist. He lifted himself, standing beside Deputy Amos, and then looked up at me. His eyes were big with confusion and fear. And then everything happened at once. The Bryce beside Amos let out an inhuman howl and shoved the deputy, who tumbled off the cliff. His arms windmilled helplessly as he fell. Gunshots rang out from the silent woods behind me, and the Bryce thing fled, whooping into the trees. "Crap!" I heard Roxanne yell. She ran up to me, hands wrapped in a professional grip around her pistol. "I told you that wasn't Bryce." "I'm Bryce." The boy holding my hand added helpfully. He looked nervously at Roxanne's weapon. "So that means you're not going to shoot me, right?" "Right." Roxanne smiled grimly. "I'm not going to shoot you, kid. What we've got to do now is get you home." We crept up to the cliff edge to see what could be done for Deputy Amos, but it was useless. He lay at the bottom of the 90-foot precipice, long hair spread out behind his shattered head like a silver halo. I covered Bryce's eyes before he could peer over the edge. All around us, the hills echoed with strange noises. They were identical to the sound the Bryce thing had made, a weird mix of a whoop and a howl. Roxanne covered Bryce and I as we made the last slog to the cars. Those howls made it seem like the things were everywhere, but I couldn't see anything but gnarled trees and rocks. The overcast dusk didn't help any matters. It turned everything to shades of bluish gray, except for the occasional points of light between the pines that might or might not have been eyes. Roxanne stuffed Bryce into the back of her car and started the engine the moment that we had reached the road. Her tires spun in the dirt as we pulled out. In the mirror behind us, I saw two shadowy figures running out of the woods behind us. They looked like Samir and Evan, and Roxanne had guessed my thoughts. If it's really them, they can drive back after us. If not, there are things that can only leave the forest if someone invites them. You've got a lot of explaining to do, I rasped, pouring water down my throat. Maybe, Roxanne nodded, but let's get back to town first. We bumped and rattled down the narrow dirt road that led through that world of cliffs and endless trees. Bryce dozed fitfully in the back seat, his tiny hand wrapped around the half-eaten energy bar that I had given him. It would be more than miles before I fell asleep. Snow was falling when we skidded into the police station parking lot. The yellowish lights spilling in its doors and windows were the only lights still on in the tiny town of Halleck's Point. My girlfriend Roxanne had much more experience with search and rescue than I did, and so it was she who lifted the sleeping child from her back seat and carried him into the tiny station to offer our grim report. Still exhausted from my harrowing experience in the winter woods, I limped in after her and tumbled into the first chair that I saw. The first thing we heard was a low, visceral moan. "Bryce!" Carmen burst from the back office to throw her arms around her child. Bryce struggled grumpily as Carmen held him to her chest, sobbing. The boy had been missing for over 72 hours, considering the freezing weather and the cruel terrain. I suspect that even his mother had given up hope. "He's probably a little hungry and dehydrated, but he mostly seems all right," Roxanne informed her. He then leaned around her, directing her next words to the sheriff. "He'll need to be checked for frostbite, among other things." "Amos?" Sheriff McCauley asked gruffly. "The deputy didn't make it. Searchers Samar Patel and Evan Pickett are also missing." "Ah, Jesus." McCauley leaned back in his worn-out rolling chair and stroked his stubble. "My department isn't prepared to handle this. Heck, my department wasn't prepared to handle one missing kid. I'm gonna have to call this in. Carmen, honey, you think you can run the Bryce over to the hospital yourself?" Carmen nodded, still too choked up to speak. As she laughed, Roxanne put a hand on her shoulder. "No stops," I heard my girlfriend murmur. "Straight to the hospital. I know it looks bad out there, but don't pick up any hitchhikers no matter who they are." Okay. Well, thank you both again so much. Once things are calmer, Abby and I would love to do something special to show our appreciation. You saved our son's life." With a last concerned look over her shoulder at us, Carmen with her son vanished into the night. "I'm sorry," Sheriff McCauley sighed, "but I'm gonna have to ask you folks to head back to wherever you're staying as well. And don't think we're not grateful. You heard this woman. That boy's alive and well because of all you. But things are about to get real crazy around here. Man, I don't got time or the space." "We understand," Roxanne cut in. "We're pretty beat and we'll be heading back to Point Lodge if you need us for anything." After roughly marking the locations of Deputy Amos's body and the other searchers' disappearance on the sheriff's map, Roxanne drove us back to our kitschy pine cabin at the Point Lodge Motel. Now, I'd like to say that I helped Roxanne secure and lock up the cabin, or demanded an explanation for the strange things I had experienced during Bryce Hartford's rescue. The truth is that I face-planted onto the nearest bed and fell asleep without even taking off my boots. The last thing I remember was Roxanne peering out of the peephole at the snowy nighttime parking lot while she locked the door, pistol in hand. The news was on when I woke up. Roxanne sat at the corner of the bed with a styrofoam cup of coffee in hand, staring intently at the screen. "You're up," Roxanne smiled. "Finally, I'm gonna go wash off." She pushed her pistol into my hand. "You've used one of these before, right? If anyone tries to come in here, you know what to do." With that, she grabbed a fluffy towel off of the radiator and turned on the shower. "You're kidding, right?" I called after her. "Right?" No response. The cold metal felt heavy and unfamiliar in my hand. I sighed and tried to focus on the television, but each time I saw movement on the other side of the transparent curtains, I expected some awful thing to come for us. I didn't even know what I was afraid of. The boogeyman, maybe. Some big, shadowy figure that would smash through the flimsy pine door and drag us away to dark places. Finished with her shower and dressed in PJs, Roxanne came back to the bed. Helicopter views of the wilderness we had trudged through played on all the local channels. Deputy Amos's death was the top story, along with our disappeared fellow search and rescue volunteers, Samir and Evan. Samir and Evan, I grunted. I thought I saw them on the edge of the trees just before we left. You saw something at the edge of the trees, Roxanne clarified. Something that might have looked like Samir and Evan, but it wasn't. With one last nervous look at the door, I gave Roxanne her pistol back. What aren't you telling me? I demanded. Why does a search and rescue volunteer need a gun? My girlfriend looked thoughtfully at the pistol and then sighed. She seemed to have made up her mind about something. I didn't expect to encounter them on your first search, Roxanne explained. I thought that I would have more time to train you in the basics of survival and navigation, so you would already be used to it when, well, it doesn't matter now. You've seen them now and there's no going back. Maybe this is for the best. It might make what I'm about to tell you a little easier to swallow. An 11-year-old girl and her family stopped for lunch at a secluded mountain lake. Seems like a perfect spot. Mom can back her SUV almost down to the shore. Dad has a view of the mountains while he barbecues off the tailgate with his portable grill. While their parents fix lunch, the girl goes for a swim. She rolls her eyes when her parents make her bring a flotation device. They wouldn't let her even dip a toe in without one. There are rumors of strong currents and deep pits beneath the cheerful, bright blue water. At first, Mom and Dad look up any time they heard their daughter squeal or scream. After a while, though, they dismiss it with a knowing smile. She's a preteen girl after all, splashing around in water so cold and clear she can see the fish beneath her toes. She is thrilled by the place and swims further out than she probably meant to. Clear as the water is, she couldn't see the bottom beneath her kicking feet. It's just a bottomless, azure abyss. She suddenly remembers her parents' warning about pits and currents, and glances nervously toward the shore. Her parents are gone. She blinks and pinches herself, but it doesn't change the empty shore in front of her. They wouldn't just leave her. There has to be an explanation. She calls out for them, swimming toward where the SUV had been parked for all she was worth. When she comes to shore, splashing, there's no sign that the car had ever been there. Not even tire tracks on the dusty dirt road. There's not a single sound or sign of life anywhere. The girl begins to panic. She tries to backtrack down the dirt road but is stopped by a four-way intersection she doesn't recognize. She had been too busy looking out the window on the drive up to remember all the turns that their SUV had made. By now, the gravel has shredded her bare feet, and a cold wind blows in front of the sun. The girl begins to seriously wonder if she'll make it out alive. And then she hears a voice. "Honey, is that you?" It comes from the woods, and it sounds exactly like her mother. The girl responds excitedly and pursues the voice deep into the woods. She doesn't notice how it eggs her on. "We're over here, honey. Just a little bit further." She jumps over moldy logs and climbs through rocky gullies until she no longer knows where the road, or even the lake, could be. Soon, she's standing in front of the black mouth of an enormous sinkhole. Ferns hang over its mossy leaves. Dew drips into a damp darkness that doesn't seem to have a bottom. She peers over the edge. "Stay right there. I'm coming to get you." That's what it takes for the girl to realize that the voice she's hearing isn't her mother. And despite her aching feet, she flees, trying to find the road. But it's just trees, trees and more trees. She doesn't even know which direction she's running in. She sees a clearing up ahead and leans against a boulder for a breather, until she sees her mom and dad on the opposite side of the trees, beckoning her. encouraging her to step back beneath the shadow of the trees. She takes off, but she twists her ankle before she even escapes the clearing. She screams. She grabs a muddy stick and uses it to propel herself further, away from the grinning faces and sing-song voices. She makes it as far as a broken slope of rust-covered rocks. Although her mind is terrified, her body just can't keep moving. She falls into the dust. She sobs and wails like she's never done before, but also she prepares. She drags herself toward one of the bigger rocks and covers herself with dirt, twigs, stones, anything she can find to keep the wind off and keep her hidden. Her teeth chatter until they ache. The shelter and coverings that she made protect her from hypothermia, just barely. She drifts off to the sound of unearthly voices calling her name beneath unfamiliar stars. When she wakes up, it's daylight again. The girl still hears her name shouted into the wind, but this time it's different. For one, the person yelling isn't anyone that she knows. It's a pot-bellied guy with a black beard and a hunter orange jacket. He looks around carefully, and then he picks his nose. He tries to wipe his booger on his boot, trips, curses, and then kicks the rock that almost made him fall. That's how the girl knows that he's human. She tries to respond to him, but her throat is choked with dust. She tries to run to him, falls and crawls instead. She pulls herself up onto a boulder, waving her hands, but his back is to her. Out of options, she hurls a rock at him. It doesn't go far, but the tiny rock slide that it creates makes him turn around. He meets the girl's gaze and then calls something in on his shortwave radio. Later, the girl finds out that the search and rescue team, the big, bearded man is a part of, wasn't even looking for her, or at least, not only her. They were looking for the girl's parents who were reported missing by her dad's coworker a few days ago. The girl is confused. According to the bearded man and his rugged-looking pals, 4 days had passed, but for the girl, it had been less than 24 hours. One thing, however, is certain. The girl's parents are nowhere to be found. She wonders about what happened to them. Was their experience like her own? Were they called into the woods by her voice, led up to some dark pit and finally, what? Killed, eaten, taken somewhere else, transformed into something else? The fact is, the more she tries to tell her story to the search and rescue team, the more muddled it becomes, until not even the girl is sure what happened. The image of that black hole in the deep woods grows larger and larger in her mind, until its blackness blots out everything else. I went to a dark place, she tells police and researchers, until even she believes it. The girl swam too far out, and her parents got lost looking for her. That was the official version, and for many years, the girl convinces herself that it's true. But nightmares, hypnosis, regression therapy, and other stranger methods lead her back to the truth. Something unexplainable happened at that lake, and it might have happened to other people as well. Roxanne took a deep breath and then shot a Dixie cup of water like it was whiskey. Her story was definitely weird, but I didn't see what it had to do with Bryce's disappearance until... I was that girl, Roxanne murmured. Summer of '98. We had our whole lives ahead of us. Teardrops appeared on the cheesy black bear print quilt. I held her. That's what got you into this, I reasoned. You became a search and rescue volunteer to figure out what happened to your parents. I've done search and rescue for 15 years now, and I still don't have any answers. I still don't know how the thin places work. Thin places, I probed. That's just what I call them, Roxanne sniffed. They show up everywhere if you're looking for them. Different cultures at different times. It shows up again and again. This idea that there are spots where whatever divides our realities from other realities is weak. Thin places are spots where it's possible to pass through to other places, and maybe things from there can cross over as well. And, I peeked out the curtains at the endless rows of ridges and pine trees. Do they always show up in places like this? Look, thin places often seem to show up on remote patches of government land. I'm not sure if that's a coincidence or not. I'm not sure if they're drawn somehow to desperate people and empty spaces. I'm not sure if they're open or closed, move or stay still. I put so much of my life into this, and it's like I haven't made any progress at all. Roxanne stood and paced angrily around our tiny room. You saved Bryce, I whispered. Probably a lot of other people too. Okay, fine, Roxanne admitted. But what about me? Where's my happy ending? When do I get to see my parents walk out of the woods and hug them till the paramedics separate us? When do I at least get some closure? Her shouts ended. The silence deepened. That was a mistake. I never should have brought anyone with me. Why don't we go now? I interjected. What? You say that the thin places seem to be two-way, right? And if Samar and Evan, or the things pretending to be them, are still running around out there, the gateway must still be open. So let's go. Not to rescue anyone, not to bring back proof. Just to see if there's anything we can learn about what happens to people who end up there. People like your parents. How long have I known you again? Roxanne crossed her arms skeptically. Look, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't really think you understand what you're offering. I mean, even if we find a way to cross over, it's pretty likely that neither of us will make it back. It's crazy, I know. I bent over, repacking my gear and tossing Roxanne the keys. Which is why we better get out there before I change my mind. It was an odd feeling, trying to find the place where we had been lost before. As Roxanne parked along the side of the dirt road where we had searched for Bryce, my eyes drifted to the tree line. I remembered how the things that looked like our friends had lingered there, just beyond the reach of light. How their eyes seemed to glow as red as the taillights as we fled. The hunt for our missing companions, Samir and Evan, continued, but from where we stood, even the helicopter sounded far away. Instead of the coughs and curses and shouts of the other searchers, there was only a heavy silence that felt like an extra weight to my pack. Roxanne and I talked about our gear, our intended path, the sweat on our butts, and even the weather. Anything to avoid mentioning the thin places. Anything to avoid mentioning our goal. The forest, however, wouldn't let me forget. Every rustle in the undergrowth or clatter of stones from a cliff set my teeth on edge. Roxanne had done search and rescue enough to distinguish important sounds from unimportant ones. I apparently had not. That first day, we made camp in good spirits, although I didn't feel comfortable navigating alone. I was starting to get the hang of the compass and the map. Roxanne was quiet and thoughtful. I figured that's like me. She had never gone out this far without a crew before. Huddled against Roxanne in my sleeping bag that night, I found myself hoping that things would go like this until our supplies ran out. What if we never found anything, then just returned home and put all of this behind us? We set out with the dawn in a gray haze. Damp rocks and ferns, white mist, and the loomish, greenish-black shadows of pine trees. That was our whole world. The fog had an odd way of muffling sound. I thought that I heard deer grunting behind me, but when I turned, I only saw a wall of white. A while later, Roxanne pointed out 3 deer in the distance. They all stood stock still, observing us. Maybe it was just a trick of the mist, but I'd swear the deer stood up on 2 legs and walked off after we had passed by. Maybe it was the fog that interfered with Roxanne's GPS equipment. We hadn't been dating long, but I recognized that face she made when she scrunched up her eyebrows and scrutinized the little device. It was the face of someone who just added 2 + 2 and got 5. Is there a problem? I asked. We were standing in a trailless patch of knee-high ferns. The mist had lifted, but the bits of sky beyond the trees were still a sea of gray. GPS is malfunctioning, Roxanne grunted. It's happened before, usually when we're close, I finished. Yeah. Our little conversation felt swallowed up by the size and silence of the woods around us. Roxanne took a deep breath, checked her map and compass, and trudged forward. We had gone a long way by the time we realized that the compass couldn't be trusted either. I stared stupidly at the needle while it spun freely. Roxanne and I scanned the trees around us for a direction, a landmark, anything, until our eyes settled on Samir's hunter orange jacket. Hung high on several branches with the arms extended, it looked like the torso of a crucified man. Who or what had put it up there, I wondered, and why? Let's keep moving. Roxanne tugged at my sleeve. I don't know about you, but I don't relish the idea of spending the night with that thing hanging over us. She was right. It was already dusk and a twisted ankle could be fatal out here. Roxanne headed uphill, hoping to find an open ridge where we might get our bearings. It would have to wait until the morning though, because stars were twinkling overhead by the time that we found a spot to camp. They're beautiful, aren't they? I stood, looking into the cosmos above us. It's like you don't really see the night sky until you come out to a place like this, you know. That's because this isn't our night sky, Roxanne sighed, not even turning away from the tent that she was setting up. What? I know how to navigate by the stars. Those aren't our stars. I felt the blood rush to my face. But don't be afraid, Roxanne went on. I'm not a kid anymore. This time we came to this place by choice, wherever it is. We can leave the same way. We have to believe that. Do you believe it? I do, I nodded. I didn't. Well, then let's get some sleep, cause from this point on, I don't know what we're going to find. The next morning, it was what I couldn't find that made me panic. Where was Roxanne? I had a fuzzy memory of her rustling around in the dark, slipping away outside of the tent. The sky was still gray. Nothing but trees and stony ridges as far as the eye could see. And no Roxanne. The wind whipped around me and I shouted her name. What? Roxanne emerged from behind a tree, pulling up her pants. You look like you've seen a ghost. No, it's just... I trailed off. Something was bothering me, but what? I could have put my finger on it. Nothing, I guess. Let's keep moving. Roxanne and I usually discussed our route, but not that day. She set off downhill so quickly that I struggled to keep up. Where are we going? You'll know it when you see it, Roxanne snapped. I got some idea of what she meant as we walked. The landscape was subtly changing as we walked. Instead of rugged mountains, it was taking on the shape of what might be found around a California lake. A lake like the one where Roxanne's parents had disappeared to. Gray rocks turned to a dusty red. Tall pines were replaced by shrub and cacti. Roxanne, what's going on? I shouted over gusts of arid wind. We're getting close. I could barely hear her reply over gusts of arid wind. They seemed to come from everywhere all of a sudden, pushing us forward toward a cave. A black hole surrounded by dripping ferns, the nightmarish pit from Roxanne's story. If it was really Roxanne leading me here, I froze. Back at the campsite, had I checked to be sure that it was really her and not something else? Suddenly I wasn't so sure. Roxanne pressed ahead, but I lingered, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Found you! I jumped and spun and slipped on a wet root, and nearly fell into Samar's chest. He gave me a big grin. Why was he still wearing his orange vest? We had seen it, name tag and all, hanging from a tree. Found you, Samar said again, his smile widening. Found you! 3 pistol shots. Samar's head split like a melon. I screamed. Roxanne had just killed someone, or had she? Samar, or the thing that looked like him, didn't seem to be bothered by having his head blasted in half. It stood there patiently, repeating the same words over and over while smoking bits of skull and brain matter dripped down its visible throat. Teeth fell out of its shattered jaws as it spoke, but it didn't stop. Found you, found you. Its shrieking gurgle reached a fever pitch that echoed all around us. I looked down at its hands. The fingers splintered, and then shot towards us, some shooting through the air like vines, others slithering along the dirt for our legs like obscene snakes with dirty fingernail faces. Run! Roxanne shouted, firing 2 more useless shots into the thing's chest. As it lurched forward, I felt one of its freakishly long fingers slither around my ankle. I moaned, stopped, and kept sprinting, although I could see that it was hurting us toward the pit. Its dark abyss beckoned to us both. It was the feeling that I had had many times before standing on a high ledge. That little voice that whispers to jump and see what might happen, magnified by 1,000. It was like the land itself was shifting, sucking us in. Roxanne, running a bit ahead of me, noticed it first. The feeling that the ground beneath our feet had become too steep to turn or halt our descent. Her red ponytail flashed for a second as she spun, mouth open to warn me, and then she was gone, devoured by the blackness. I couldn't have stopped even if I wanted to. I grabbed at stray roots and plants, but my fingers slipped away. I was in free fall. All light disappeared. And then I was out again. Somehow walking up the same impossible slope that I had just fell down, into the same bizarre clearing. The weird physics of it all made me so dizzy that I fell to my knees on the damp ground. Treetops were spinning overhead. I shut my eyes tight. When I opened them again, the colors felt wrong, the air tasted different, and I wasn't alone. Ahead of me, Roxanne too grabbed at fistfuls of dirt and retched. A familiar-looking figure watched over her. So familiar. She looked like a slightly older version of Roxanne. Her mother. And a slim, mustached man in plaid. Her father. If their close in age were any indicator, the pair hadn't changed at all since they had disappeared. I've come back, Roxanne said, to rescue you. Rescue us? Roxanne's mother laughed. No, it is we who are rescuing you. Darling, Roxanne's father explained kindly. Where you're from, your body will grow old, get sick, and die. You're bound to one form. Here, there is no death, only endless rebirth. That's why we always search for and rescue those who are lost on the other side. Roxanne's mother went on, to bring them here, where our forms are infinite. As she spoke, her torso stretched horribly, extending like a giant centipede rearing to strike. Mossy antlers grew from the back of her skull and her face warped into a nightmarish blend of human and deer. Her father's body changed as well, splitting into 3 like a folding paper cutout. The tendrils that connected his 3 parts squirmed and writhed like maggots and rotten fruit. We could hear bones snapping and watch the dark, flowing blood. But the 2 things in front of us seemed completely unbothered by their transformation. And that wasn't all. I realized that the entire glade in which we stood was alive and conscious. The ferns and leaves stood on end, quivering with anticipation, perhaps to consume what was left after the things that had been Roxanne's parents had finished with us. The trees, too, creaked and leaned forward hungrily, old men bending over their dinner table. Winged things settled onto the branches, and other, less describable forms twisted themselves out of the mossy ground. The ground. Even the dirt beneath our feet was shifting, closing the gap to the world that we had come from. Roxanne's parents' speech and transformation had just been a ruse to distract us while the way was shut. I staggered forward on the uneven living terrain, grabbed Roxanne's hand, and hurled myself toward the closing pit. The pit had been enormous, but it was barely shoulder wide when I passed through, even tighter for Roxanne. Dirt closed in around us and I felt Roxanne's wrist slipping through my fingers. I clawed in the powder dirt in front of me and realized that the physics had changed. I was clawing up instead of down. Spitting and hacking, I pulled myself into the ferny grove and did what I could to dig Roxanne out. I had barely cleared room for her to breathe when I felt something wrap around my ankle and pull. The forest wasn't letting us go. Whatever had grabbed me also had Roxanne. Her green eyes widened as she was dragged back into the loose earth. I watched her twist and flail as she disappeared. The grasp on my ankle released. I screamed my girlfriend's name and dug at the loamy soil, but she was gone, swallowed by the other side. I dug until my fingernails were black and bleeding, until I had no strength left in my arms and I rolled over, filthy and exhausted, to stare up at a cloudy sky that was only just beginning to clear. "It's you." Samar's voice caused me to flip and climb up to my feet, ready to run, but the man in front of me was as filthy as I was, and not wearing his orange jacket. Evan limped behind him, his leg in a lashed-together wooden splint. "Feels like we've been out here for weeks, man," Evan grunted, and then he seemed to notice for the first time that I was alone. "Where's the rest of your crew?" I punched the dirt and cried. Without Samar and Evan's help, I'm sure that I would have died out there. None of us knew the way back, but whatever was affecting the area had dissipated enough for our instruments to slowly begin to work. The GPS signal was still spotty and the compass needle drifted more than it should, but they were accurate enough to get us back to the forest road. From there, we were spotted by the helicopter, and soon Samar and Evan were answering local reporters' questions about their harrowing experience. I hung back on purpose. I didn't have the heart to talk to anyone, and all I asked from the rest of the search and rescue crew was that they dropped me off at Roxanne's car, which fortunately I had my own keys to. As I opened the car door, I tried to shut out the image of all the memories we had shared in her second-hand car, but I was surprised to see an envelope with my name on it in the driver's seat. If you're reading this, it means that I'm gone. Don't think of it as an end. Think of it as the beginning. You see, I didn't get involved in search and rescue to find my parents. I did it to find my way home. I don't remember what I was before I took on that little girl's appearance in memory. Something went wrong in the transformation. I forgot my purpose, what I was. I even forgot about the thin places. Fortunately, those search and rescue volunteers invited me in, and I was able to keep up the act, though this place and body have never really felt like my own. I searched blindly for many years until I rediscovered the truth. When beings like you are lost, alone, or desperate, you create the thin places yourselves. Your subconsciousness calls out to them, and I needed one of you. The more time I spend close to the thin places, the more I feel like what I truly am. Where I'm from, we don't have concepts of love or guilt or gratitude, so consider this a kind of gift. Forget me, forget search and rescue, and stay away from lonely places. They might just invite you in. Yours, Roxanne.